Go live! Go live! We shall go live. It's one of those days. Sarcasm alert! Sarcasm alert! There will be lots today. There will be lots today. Sarcasm alert. Right then. So yes, I'm doing a current analysis, and honestly, I tend to not get involved in these unless I think it's useful and there's historical utility in getting involved in them. So that is what I've done. I have allowed this through, and I'm getting into this, and I'm going to approach this in my own inimitable sarcastic fashion. Hello, my name's Dr. Clarke, and I'm going to be your guide to, well, this world, this wacky, crazy world. And first of all, I need to tie up the dog biscuits so that the dog will get them when he comes back in here. And I need to fix that. And then I need to say hello to you all. Oof, yes, I've been walking the dogs. It's a hot and sunny day. So, yeah. You're all lucky. You're not closer. Oh, we got 9. And there's 9. And it's the Thursday, the 19th of May. It is gonna be a fun day. So, hello everyone. Let's see. Let's say hello to people. I'm in an interesting mood, I will warn you now. I have taken a gamble, and I have spent the 1,000-odd pounds of Amazon today, and I am now hoping the paychecks and everything arrive on time, so I don't end up having problems on my credit card, but we'll leave that to one side. Ouch! But, yeah, all the stuff is now on its way. Hello, DH89. Hello, 96831. When did you get an ebook? I think TBD was supposed to be an ebook from the beginning. But there's a few other ones I'm actually working on. Hello, I was asking. Nice one. Here's a question for Chat to Museum. What if 3 British battleships had catastrophic exploded at Jutland, not the battlecruisers? Expect a more Queen Elizabeth-like successor class to be built. Honestly, that is what you'd be looking at. You would be talking. It would probably be. It's a case of if you lose 3 battleships rather than 3 battle cruisers, expect them to go with the fast battleships, sort of the Queen Elizabeth class, but pushing up for 28, 30 knots rather than looking for a 36-knot battle cruiser. So expected to go from that angle. That'd be more what they'd be pushing for. So it could well be not G3-ish, but N3-ish, 18-inch, but slightly faster. That's probably what you'd be seeing built, in which case Lord helped them with the Washington Naval Treaty. This is what people often forget. They think the G3 is this. No. The G3 is there is a 2-ship group being built, 2 classes. There is the G3s and there's the N3s. And the thing is, the G3s are going to come into service first because they need the battlecruisers sooner. But that doesn't mean they aren't working on the battleships. And that's the thing. The G3s are battlecruisers in an N3 battleship world. That's the thing. They're not battleships. They are battlecruisers. But they are such battlecruisers that they put up, make other battleships. Some battleships look a bit worried, and that shows you how battleships, the battleships of them will be. Hello, John Shea. Hello, Andrew Paul. Hello, Roland Cash. Hello, Rick Basalva. Hello, Calvin Gasberg. Hello, DH89. Hello, Sage. Hello, DG40. Hello, Stafford Thompson. Hello, Atreus Verdun. Hello, Carl Bogerson. Hello, welcome to the first time made live. Hello, Esther Shaw. Hello, Stephen Richards. Hello, Colin Cameron. Hello, Jay Mingworth. Hello, David Hunt. Hello, John Luke. Hello, Bichon. Hello, Jess P. I haven't seen you in a while. Hope you're well. And hello, New Accurate also 72. Too many YouTubers start talking or singing before their viewers can click through the ads. Well, yes, but the singing is basically a nice way of filling in before the ads are out. It means you don't miss any history. HMS Verdun, a Queen Elizabeth class with small tube boilers and triples are 18 inches after the Jutland. I'd hate to think what Yamato is done at that point. Yeah, that's the thing. Think of it as a think of it as someone probably trying to go for 18-inch guns and a Queen Elizabeth style format. Or possibly going, with aiming for 28 to 30 knots and a battleship form. Yeah. Hello everyone. So, let's start off with the ground rules for today. I'm going to try and keep things as sane and to the point as I can. I'm going to try and keep things within the realities of what is likely to happen. I also, as well as warning you for how, because we know me having spent a lot of money can make me very, very cynical about the spending of money of politicians. But also, I haven't yet had food today. So, food might arrive. I'm giving you the heads up that I could be hungry. And the reason food hasn't arrived is because I've been dealing with it. If anyone, I'm just going to deal with this now, because I could be having some people watching. You'll notice that there has been the research education framework results came out about a week ago, over last week or so. And some universities have done really well. Yay. Some universities have done quite well. Yeah. But even if you've done well, that hasn't insulated some departments from being cut. And most of the departments being cut have been humanities, history departments, and politics departments, and classics departments, and those sort of teams. And they're being cut on the altar of STEM. I usually teach people STEM, as in science, humanities, technology, engineering, mathematics is the best sort of form because one teaches you what you can do and one teaches you whether you should do it and allows you to sort of work things through. But that's happened and that has caused my week to disintegrate even more as I've been dealing with friends, some of them very, very good historians and very, very good philosophers, people who've worked a long time and very hard in their field have lost their roles. And it's devastated them. And there's a few of them looking at me and going, why aren't you as devastated as I am? And I'm going, well, because honestly, there are three things. One, I came to the view that the odds of me getting a full-time post anywhere for a while was not going to happen because honestly, I don't publish books and journal articles quickly enough. It's a factor of my dyslexia to an extent, but it's also a fact in that sort of in that. And I'd say I don't teach dyslexia as a disability, as I treat it as a learning difference, and because of my learning differences and my style, I am slower. I do more drafts and I'm slower to produce. And what I produce, I hopefully is good quality, but it takes me longer to produce it. And that means it takes me a while to reach the level at which I might get tenure and might get a tenure post. I accepted this. But also there's the fact that I do this work as well. So to me, I do the YouTube stuff. I do the public speaking side. I do what I call a lot of public facing history. A lot of coming into your television screens, coming into your computer screens history, and putting a history across that way. And that means, to an extent, whilst I'm not insulated from what's happening in my wider profession, I am, to an extent, removed from it in that I have not just the one employer in university. I work for a couple of universities as a contract lecturer. Contract lecturers are being got rid of, are just not getting their contracts renewed, by the way. That's the figures you never hear. The contract lecturers aren't sacked. We just don't get our contracts renewed. That's it. No one goes on protest over us. No one strikes over us. They just go, and worry about the tenure posts. But leaving that to one side, I have all of you. And if we want to put it another way, you're all my employers as well. The people who watch the videos, who put on who are patrons, who watch things, you're my employers, because if you like my videos, you watch more, and I get the advertising revenue, or you do super chats, or super thanks, or you become subscribers or patrons. And that means, to an extent, I don't have to worry so much about whether arch chancellors love or hate history. But I would also say the very success of channels like mine, like Drakenfels, like all the other ones that you can see around there, history ones, and there are some great history ones out there, suggests that perhaps some people saying that history is not something which is going to get you a job and it's not going to give you the skills for life are being a bit silly. They're being very myopic and single track focused, because really these things, they require you to start thinking about how you're going to use them, and that takes time. Anyway, hello, my name's 6040. Hello, Graham Hunter, and hello, everyone. I thought you taught the very smart people how to talk to the stupid people in charge. Oh, I do that as well. I teach engineers quite often, and that causes me that's also causing fun, because there are even some engineering departments going, well, do we need to teach them these historian? And I go, I teach them the communication skills. Excuse me, I teach them how to do the stations, and it's quite fun, because every time, and as I said, there is likelihood of one of my employers is likely to cut my role. But they've said that, but they've already started realizing, backtracking to an extent on that, and hopefully won't do that, because they've realized then they would have to take over teaching what I teach. And none of the engineers want to teach it. So we will see what happens. Right then, so here is the Canada trip. The public lectures, they are hopefully going to happen. They haven't yet confirmed the venues. They haven't yet confirmed which organisations are. And there's about 3 different organisations having conversation on the public lecture date number 1. About 2 having conversations on public lecture number 2. We'll see what happens. There could also be a SimSec event in Halifax, which will be a SimSec hosted drinks get-together session, where me and Drac will be there to chat away with people. There is, of course, the dinner being organised by Stafford and Wayne, which is open to everyone. They are still deciding on venue. But please, if you go to the Discord channel down below, you will find, if you go to the Discord link down below, you will find on the server, you will find a channel which is dedicated to it. They'll be updating and putting details there. They're really nice and being really helpful. Right. Plenty of Politics 1. I use lots of stuff I learned during history in my politics modules in my job as a lawyer. Yeah, I know. One of the interesting things is quite a lot of those people who say STEM is the future. If you look around the politicians who run the countries, most of them, their first degrees are not STEM. Most of their first degrees are humanities or classics or PPE. Politics, philosophy, and economics, that PPE stands for, if you haven't already heard. Yeah. And before anyone thinks this is a right or left wing, honestly, these degrees have been under attack for the last 20 odd years. And whilst, yes, it's coming to the place now, it's the universities, which university leadership, which is making the decision. The government might be preferring to fund STEM degrees because they can see that as more directly economically powerful. But yeah, it's universities making decisions. I brought British aircraft carriers design, development, and service histories by Kindle edition by David Hobbs today. Oh, fun. Brimballs, similar vein, if 3 German battlecruisers sank on the spot instead of limping home, How much more aggressive would the RN be? If the Germans had lost 3 battle cruisers, probably the British would have stayed pretty much the same, but they might have dared a battle cruiser raid into the Baltic. They might have risked it, especially once they had Renown, Repulse, Courageous, and Glorious online. Once you had those 4, and with all the other battle cruisers, you could probably leave the slower battle cruisers to sort of cover the exit, and the faster ones would go charging in, and slower ones would be mated up with the Queen Elizabeth class. And that could be quite a scary thing for the Germans to deal with. 96 rolling. Hey, I just got a new. I hope you're comfortable and you sleep well. I just read that quickly before I read it out loud. Rankash, Doug Clarke, do you think that future ships of the Royal Navies will be able to address the newly discovered laser gap with the Russian forces? Gun have you thought about doing an instructional video series on how to approach university essay writing and research, and perhaps the basics of public speaking on one of the paid sites? No, I have that series. I have the teaching series on this channel, which are free. They have no advertising on them at all, and they're for my students, and they're for anyone who wants to go see them on how to use academic skills and academic writing and all the stuff. They're all roughly 15 minutes. Actually, I was going to say, I learned much of my skills from my job in my degrees, history and politics, and then international security masters. Hi, Jack Ray. Hi, Santa Canera. They cut business English for our curriculum. Someone. Heading into a recession, depression, being available and replaceable is always great traits to have for employers. Unis don't know what they're missing by jogging you along. It's fun to wind them up. Although, when I helped people work on impact on the ref in a previous role, when it first came in, gatekeeping was horrendous. Work which improves worlds, no, I just want to write articles from my tower. Yeah, there is all sorts of weird stuff in the ref, I do agree with that. So there you go. Hood finishes constructional fitting in June 1918. How much does that change things? If she's in service in June 1918, there might be a battle cruiser raid. Might be. Hello, Go Lander. No, second. What if the Royal Navy had all 12 Type 45s planned and ordered 8 more plus 3 Type? Okay. Well, let's put it this way. If the Royal Navy has managed to get 12 Type 45s plus 8 you're saying the Royal Navy's got 20 Type 45s. 20 roughly 20 and roughly 40 20 Type 45s and 40 Type 26s. In a world where the Royal Navy's got 20 Type 45s and 40 Type 26s, they have got a massive budget, which is very nice and hypothetical, but well over off the topic of this one. Yes, please. I continue my patron support because I respect your knowledge and development passion for you. Thank you. Even though I must admit I have got very bad and haven't updated the slides up there on Patreon for ages. That's because I've got them all sitting in a folder to get around them, and it's just that's the thing which keeps getting put to one side because that's the quick admin role. Realistically, sticking them up. It's one of those things. The easy job is the job which keeps being put off, and is now got massive, and I've got to basically spend a couple of days sitting down and doing it. We'll see about lasers. I'll leave lasers to bilge pumps. Right. So, why accept future on a history channel? Because, well, as I said, I'm going to do it grounded in history. I'm going to look at their strategic situation. I'm going to look at their historical norm and their current defense political standing. Working from that, I'm going to put down what they are likely to do, and I'm also give you a historian's twist on what they should do. That's fun, isn't it? A historian's twist on what they should do. So that should be fun. Bye-bye. There we go. How does a Voxo? Yeah, in terms of really, it's the easy job that's being put off. Like the RN not building up escort ships. No, that's more due to treasury funding. The easy job would be recruiting more people by just putting the wages up. Well, you have a handheld laser that you've managed to shoot down a drone from 5 kilometers away. Look, at some point, someone is going to start using industrial lasers to shoot down drones. And then we're going to see drones getting armored. And it's kind of like you're seeing the First World War all over again, but this time it's drones rather than crewed aircraft. Because you have to remember the first aircraft were used as spotters. And then they started taking pistols up with them to engage in air-to-air warfare. And then they mounted machine guns. And slowly you developed fighters and bombers and all those sorts of aircraft, as would happen in the First World War. The same thing is happening with UAVs. How does possible nuclearization of Belarus impact RAF and RN strategic chance? Not much. Because, let's be honest, Belarus doesn't have a coastline, and the RAF, if they're involved, are doing it in support of Poland or other people. And also, the RAF... Well, the RAF doesn't... Britain doesn't have any land-based or any sea-based at the moment anti-ballistic missiles or ABM systems. So, yeah. Our only response to if anyone nukes us is nukes. So we're the one you least want to send a nuke at, because we go from 0 to we're blasting everything. Theoretically. But more likely. With the advance of anti-ship missiles and potential future cruisers, would you consider the carriers no longer being the primary strike element, but rather the sustained combat element? Well, are you suggesting those future cruise missiles can't be mounted on aircraft, and the aircraft can't increase their range and the variability of directions they can come from? It's not. It's a case of it's going to be a mixture of both. The carrier is always going to be part of the sustained combat element, especially when you consider you can actually rearm the carrier at sea, whereas at the moment you cannot reload VLS at sea. So, I'm sorry, your carrier is your critical sustainment capability. Your D plus 2 or 3 capability to keep your forces actually fighting and be able to break up your enemy strikes at longer range. But, yeah, it can still be part of your strike force. So I was trying to segue for you, Doctor. Thank you for the help. That's for sure. But all this has been happening anyway. Isn't that exactly what Predator is? An interdiction bomber. Alistair, sure. Are you suggesting that we're inventing history again and again, over and over, in rather rapid circles? Gina Hum, the future of drone warships. Well, I was once asked to talk about the future of a future flyer class, and my suggestion was that the future equivalent of a flyer class will be an uncrewed ship. It will be. And it probably will be trawler-sized. Honestly, if I was going to build it, I would build a trawler-sized vessel without a crew aboard. Axis only, and it would be basically a force multiplier, and there'd be a sort of something like a Type 26 or Type 83 sitting in the middle, providing overwatch, air defense, and the uncrewed ship would be wandering along. Code 85. Also, what they should do? Rebuild Her Majesty's Navy to pre-World War size? Not quite that, but I have some ideas. More referring to hypersonics mounted on cruisers and destroyers. Even hypersonics, if you consider some of the hypersonics, yes, theoretically, you're going to get hypersonics which are able to be mounted on aircraft, air-mounted hypersonics, and they're going to come down to they're going to be sort of funneled down and into and fitted onto strike aircraft. Yes, maybe an F-35 will only be able to carry one or two, and there'll be external stores, but they'll be able to carry them. And the thing is, it'll be the aircraft taking the role of A, giving them a bit of a range boost, but also giving them an altitude boost. So instead of them having to boost themselves up and then convert, because one of the big problems of hypersonics is that often, especially the Venturi and hypersonic engines, they need something which boosts them up. So they have a booster engine which gets them up to altitude when their hypersonic engine can kick in, and then that drops off. So if you've already got an aircraft which is doing it and which is launching you at high max speeds, that's the other interesting thing, getting a hypersonic to detach from the aircraft at max speeds. There you go. You're away. Politics. Lots of this anti-drone warfare talk reminds me of an old bilge pump on hypersonic missiles. We do like to talk about the hypersonics. Danny Hills, more referring to hypersonics mounted on cruisers. Oh, answer that one. Danny Hills, more of the greatest hits from bilge drums. There are lots of them. And there's more coming. Dennis Foxer, do you think it would hurt if someone with 120 miles, if it hit someone, if I hit some, do you think it would hurt if I hit someone with 120mm APDS FS round? Not sure there'd be much left of them to feel pain. I think it's probably going to be fairly quick if you actually hit someone with that. Yeah, someone will figure out how to do VLS reloads at sea sooner or later. Oh, the trouble is no one's been investing it for a while, and missiles have got delicate. It's going to be 20 odd years probably before you start getting them, if not longer. Because also, honestly, the thing I would think about is if you can make it so you can insert the box around the missile and put that into the launcher. That's what you could do, but you need to be so delicate and careful and not bash them. It's very, very careful. It's very, very careful. If you remember correctly, shells are actually very robust compared to missiles. So it's gonna take time. It really is to get it to that level. It is. Good man. F-35, wrong platform. That much better using a 15 to 16 Typhoon or 20 Typhoon, but they don't fly off the cumulus of class carriers. We might have a drone for it, but they don't. Currently, they don't. No, that does sound like a good idea. And Triple, 1,000 to 1,200 ton uncrewed trawler with a few 20mm guns, possibly some SAMs, a few ASW torpedoes, and systems could be a good convoy escort when paired up with a larger frigate corvette. Yep. It's basically reinventing the flower class. Kongan, do you think that nuclear letters are destroyed without being read? Do you think a PM has ordered Paris target as well as the usual suspects? There's at least one which is potential, but I'm not going to blacken the name by suggesting it. No, the initial altitude at launch is massive for range. However, aren't all hypersonic stuff just actively maneuvering ballistic RVs as opposed to powered hypersonic and atmospheric flight? There's a mixture. There's some work on the others. So, we're just about to get into Australia, which is always fun. Don't underestimate people. They'll fun away. They are in a very place Invincible's engine. Again, the Invincible class engines are far more robust than the missiles. It's what you're talking about is the shit. The engines are being able to maintained in an enclosed space, right? So you have them inside the hull. So you have less movement, but also you have them protected from the elements. VLS, you have to account for the movement of the ship, the movement of the current, and the way it's going to affect the ship, the engine, the power of the ship, the wind around it. All sorts of elements affect the loading of the VLS. Yes, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying it's not going to be quick to develop it. Going on, just out of curiosity, Doc, Meteora's anti-Escalon, good or bad? Who wins? Flip a coin. This is Voxo. Did piracy flare up at any points in World War I or World War II away from the concentrated fleets? Not really, because mainly because the areas that weren't being patrolled by dominant fleets were being patrolled by other dominant fleets. For example, the Far East, China, the problems versus China piracy the Japanese were really focusing on. Hi, GC. Then helps. Could a floating dry dock ship replace a Chevy LSC? Roll between the two ships would be identical, removing one problem factor. Practical or just nice in theory? Nice in theory, because actually you don't use floating dry docks in the middle of the ocean. You tend to use them, and you tend to put them into bays and protected areas. So you could set up a forward replenishment place using a floating dry dock, and that would probably work out quite sensible. But yeah, not going to happen otherwise. That's sure. If a proper peer-to-peer naval war happened, VLS will be able to reload at sea real fast, but there's little to drive. How? Even the US Navy no longer fits the cranes onto their ships because it got so difficult and so expensive. No one practices it. No one has a system in place to do it. You can't just magically go, we're going to do this. It's one of those things. The amount of times I get told by people, oh, replenishment C magically appears in World War II. It doesn't. They've been doing it since World War One. Okay, but let's talk about Australia and its strategic situation. Australia, as you can see, has quite a large economic exclusive zone, but it's quite concentrated, mainly around Australia. It's in the Indian Ocean, it's in the Southern Pacific, and it's in the Southeast Asia. They've also got rather large sections of Antarctica. In a proper peer-to-peer naval war, I suspect everyone runs out of missiles before you can build enough to reload them. Probably. I'm sure. Sorry you missed my point. They would invent one real quick, and not that it would have something happen. They haven't invented one. This is the thing. We did have a working system, but it was found not to work, and no one has invested and no one's developed it. There is a real problem with it. The missiles are incredibly fragile, and especially the ones which have actuators and circuits and all sorts of things in terms of controlling their active surfaces to control their movement, etc. They are very, very delicate instruments which have to be loaded incredibly carefully. So no, there is no, we will invent one or we'll get one really quickly. No, there is not. We have gone we have given ourselves, gone down a, how do I put this? a technological cul-de-sac, because we could reload systems when it was arm launchers. We can do that quite easily. We can still do that to this day. Quite easily reload magazine underneath sort of internal ship magazines and upload arm launchers. And that's one of the reasons why in build trumps we've talked about mixing the two in together. But that's not really possible. That's not being done. Everyone's relying on VLS, but you can't rearm VLS at sea. It's not. There is not a viable system. Someone suggested the other day, oh, we'll use helicopters. Really? You want to have helicopters that close to your radars? No, you don't. You could damage your very, very expensive radar. Okay, so we'll use the internal ship's crane. You don't fit the ships with the internal ship's crane, and when you did have the internal ship's crane, which took up 2 VLS cells on a launch system, by the way, it proved so damaging that on average 60% of the weapons you put away in the ship were apparently, this is one report I read, which is, I stress, I am fairly certain is not the most accurate in the world because it was an earlier one, but said 60% of of those systems loaded with it didn't work afterwards. So yeah, I don't think it's going to be magically produced. I'd say more likely they run out of missiles and everyone's using guns. Andrew Paul, a question regarding the Type 26. How similar would the City class and Hunter class be considering their displacements? 8 founders versus 10,500 tons at full load. Still pretty similar, but you're talking about a common architecture. The thing is, it's the architecture which is expensive. The actual steel and hull, that's not that expensive. And the thing is, that's the point of what we're talking about. So let's go back to Australia. Da, 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 da. Given the most recent build trumps talks about the lack of repairable warships post battle, it's a punishment of false hope. You probably need more hulls to replace also rather than reloads. Mixture of two. Basically, why have VLS taken over from the arm launchers? Because they were quicker reacting and you could fire more missiles more quickly. So they allow you to deal with a saturation attack far more easily. Aglin Sherd. Daniels. Could you store missiles in component sections and assemble them by loading the sections in from below and maybe load the head top? Idea being small pieces that are easy to move. Yeah, it gets very, very complicated when you start doing that, and then you're going to need far more crew, and you're going to need actual spaces and things to develop and store that stuff. Strike 142. Something small like a C-Scepter could probably potentially use a revolver type system fed from magazine. Larger stuff, not so much. Let's put it this way. I have done this. There is an entire video before we go too far down this road. I will just put a link down below into the video, which I did on missile launchers and VLS. I did do a video on where I did discuss the CRAM. I'll find a link after this and put it down below. Anyway, so Australia's strategic situation. Well, Australia is a kind of an interesting country. If we consider their energy policy, they have some of the world's richest uranium deposits, yet they don't have nuclear power. They rely on coal for 58.4% of their power. Dams for hydropower for 19.1%, natural gas for 13.5%, and various other sustainable material things for about 0.7% of their energy. Australia's dependence on coal has actually gone up between 2013 and 2020. But by 2020, wind power is actually at 9.9% and is now the largest increase, the largest supply. And this caused natural gas to drop to 9.9% roughly. And solar power has also gone up to 9.9%. So that's the 2013 to 2020 results. They've done quite well. But hydropower has dropped to 6.4% of its supply, and still no nuclear power. This is for a country which is literally one of the world's largest uranium producing countries. Now, if we can talk about their economy, well, they have the world's 13th largest economy and 10th highest per capita GDP, nominally, as of roughly 2017, 2018. They have done fairly well. They have an emphasis on exporting commodities rather than manufactured goods, which has meant that their economy is rather dependent upon, how do I put this, the export of raw materials as well. As such, there are issues with the Australian economy, but they have a decent sized population and they have an interesting political scenario. But they are strategically in a bit of a problem because they are culturally, economically, you could say, in terms of their social and political aspirations, more linked to the West. But economically, they have been suffering and having issues with recently the fact that they are dependent upon other powers, namely China, for their exports. A lot of their energy has to be imported because, again, they haven't exploited their own uranium mines. They sell so much uranium. They are so important, and some of the key uranium mines, especially for the UK and America, it's kind of a interesting scenario that the Australians are quite so critical to the nuclear infrastructure of the other major of the other Western powers, but they at the same time don't have it themselves. Now, hi Cascading. Thank you for coming along. Nice to hear everyone. You're jumping well far ahead. Okay, that's going to be a question for the end, roughly. Speaking of Australia. So, Australia, they're in a fairly decent strategic position, but they're also economically exposed and strategically exposed. Because let's be honest, their defensive depth is the sea. And there's a reason for this. The vast majority of the Australian population lives on the coast. And when I say on the coast, I mean within 100 miles or less of the coast. That's the vast majority of the Australian population. So if they want to protect their population centres, their cultural hubs, their economic hubs, their industrial hubs, they have to have ability to project their power beyond their shoreline. And this is their exclusive economic zone. This is the area which they are theoretically responsible for administratively. Remember, you have your territorial zone, which is roughly 10 miles out to sea, 12 miles on the sea. And then you have your exclusive economic zone, which is 200 miles out. Which is nice, might be expanded soon. But this is what their sort of economic area of dominance and responsibility is. Come, I trust this shall be a relaxed stream and interesting. It'll be a lot of sarcasm. Miles McCaskill, how? Uranium and nuclear. Some think the future of nuclear is in thorium. I'm a big fan of LFTR in theory. There are options. Then maybe they're worried about the human impact of any accidental contaminating high population density areas like the outback. Look, there are options, and what I found in history, one of the interesting things looking at the history of nuclear power in Australia is that at times they flirt with it, they build the facilities for it, and then they get rid of it. They don't actually follow through, and it's you can understand to an extent the upset, the worry about nuclear power and nuclear. You know, there are safety worries to have, but we're fairly safe. It's fairly constant. And if you're actually now, they're looking at having it for their submarine arm, not having civilian nuclear power is a very big problem because that creates a large issue in terms of maintaining skills and maintaining personalities. Now, before anyone starts looking a bit wondering what's going on, there is a rather large, fluffy research assistant who's probably about to wander in. Actually, you might end up with both of them wandering in at different points. But, yeah, nuclear power is fun. And, hello. Can you come in to say hello? Or you've gone out? Okay. Alright, so, sorry, the fluffies are wandering around the garden at high speed. But, no, Australia has options. They do. Oh, look at me. Don't you know? Oh, wrong mouse. There's the trouble having two blue mice on my desk. Everyone, I'm not sure I want irradiated Aussie wildlife, given it's the one place I'd call fallout being possible. We'll try and avoid that. The future fleet is a fleet of similar ships spaced for each nation's needs, with interoperability and modularity as a priority. You're jumping well ahead now. Listen, the other Australian problem is that it's not like-minded political partners in Asia or on the other side of its main strategic rival, Indonesia. Yeah, they have issues. They really do. So you're saying that the people that are making decisions have virtually done nothing nuclear power and have done no research before? Oh my god, Chernobyl happened. Yeah, to an extent, you're definitely dealing with that scenario. Google will the Royal Australian Navy bring back battleships as massive missile launching reload at sea cable platform? I doubt it. Anyway, then we have Canada. Now, Canada is another fun country. Let's consider their economy is described as a highly developed mixed market economy and the world's 8th largest economy. It's kind of helped by the fact that their immediate neighbor to their south shares linguistics and a lot of trade with them. So they tend to work quite well that. Plus, they have quite a lot of goods trade links across the nearest ocean as well. Basically, they are fairly integrated into the American system, which does give them assistance economically, but also means their economy has a big impact on the American system as well. Canada has some of the most extensive free trade agreements in the world, and this particular the particular one I've got, picture I've got, won't actually display on the screen, helpfully enough. But yeah, they've done a lot of free. They've got a lot of free trade agreements going, including, of course, they have free trade with New Zealand, Australia, America, and Britain. Hello, Kevin Ray. Thank you for becoming a supporter. Now, they also do a lot of science technology stuff. They have good education. They have good all these sorts of things. Their energy policy is also quite nice and mixed, which does help. Trust me, having a mixed energy policy and having the actual having the systems to back it up helps when you have an energy diversity. Their armed forces are fairly secure. But the trouble for Canada is that a lot of their border for much of the year, if not a whole year, is ice. They are bordering straight onto the North Pole, onto the northern, the Arctic regions. That's the Antarctic. That's the Arctic. Sorry, I'm having Arctic-Antarctic confusion going on in my brain. We'll call it brain farts if I get it wrong. Anyway, they also have the fact that their directly opposite neighbor, therefore, is Russia. This is a problem for Canada because they get picked on by pretty much everyone because they are considered nice people and they won't respond. For example, China pretty much held some of their people hostage. Russia stares across and goes, what are you going to do? And Canada has the problem that because they're nice, they do tend to expect other people to respond. Let me rephrase that. Because Canada has a habit of being very respectful in their language and the way they treat people. It's kind of like New Zealand. Again, diplomatically, they're very respectful. They expect other people to behave the same. And they get a shock when other people don't, which isn't really fair on them because they're doing what people really should be like. But the trouble is, humanity isn't often not what it's supposed to be like. Cascadian, why is Australia so seemingly against nuclear power? Because Australia's had issues with, we could say political corruption, but we can also suggest that they had problems with that. They had a very large employment sector and coal was very important to it. So it's kind of like Russia. I'm far from an expert on Australia, but the impression I get is the corporate corruption over politics is harder than other Western countries. Not so much not so much corruption as the way they skew the economy. They are trying to look at it's nuclear power doesn't want to employ as many people. Go away, mosquito. Don't try and get my own brew. Nuclear power won't sustain as many jobs in terms of directly as the coal industry, so they've been favouring the coal industry. I would have zero problems with nuclear power station being built with CANDU type reactors within 5 kilometers of where I live. I would announce plans for trained chimpanzees to operate it. Trained chimpanzees are very trustworthy. Robert Roberts. Canada's government is dominated by. Not sorry, it's dominated by the French Canadians, but they're certainly acting up at the moment. But there again, the French Canadians are a significant political force, and you have to remember them. It's kind of like in the UK, we have to remember Scots. The Arctic is on the top where Santa lives. I knew I was getting it right. I don't know, beware the nice ones. I'm always beware the nice ones. I'm looking forward to visiting Canada. I like Canada. Go, wait, aren't they formal British colonies? How could they be so naive? They're not formal British colonies. We don't have formal colonies anymore. We have protectorates, dependencies, and we have the Commonwealth, which are basically friends, colonies who we managed to make friends by some trick of fate. Now, after Canada, we have New Zealand. Now, New Zealand is another country which relies on its niceness, but it has one problem. Australia's population, let's see, I've got stats here. Population in 2022 is roughly 26 million. That's an estimate. Canada's population, as of roughly 2022, 38.5 million. New Zealand's population. Well, 5 million. Don't take this the wrong way, world, but New Zealand has actually a smaller population than Scotland. Actually, New Zealand technically has a smaller population than London. If we consider Britain's population, the UK's population, which is another country we're going to look at, is 67 million. So the UK has the population of not quite all of the other three discussed in this combined. Not quite. But yeah, it's jolly close. New Zealand is another country which has a significant Antarctic presence. It is another country which has a significant exclusive economic zone compared to its size. And again, New Zealand and Australia both have significant commitments in the island nations of the Pacific. Okay, they have significant commitments, significant friendships, significant components of their relationship are with them. And that has to be borne in mind when looking at their strategic situation. Historically, of course, they're like the British. They're sort of like the Australians. They're part of the British Empire, but they were a self-governing colony for quite a while. They had a significant naval force, and they've got to have a significant martial culture from all ethnic groups within there. Stop trying to nick my own brew, mosquito. It's always fun when they start. You can tell a mosquito which has tried to nick your iron brew. Hello, Big Fluff. You come in to say hello to people, or you just come in? You see, I put these away because I thought you weren't coming out. Sorry. There you go. Good boy. You put the biscuits away. Yeah. Hello. You taking over? All right. Knights of Garant. The Royal New Zealand Navy has only patrol vessels. No, they have a couple of frigates, and they have HMS Canterbury, which is an interesting vessel, and a few other things which are kind of interesting. Richards, we have more than the stated 38 million. Way more. I'm not sure if you do, honestly. It could feel like you do in certain areas, but it's kind of like in the UK when people go, "Oh, we are so overcrowded," and then you go, "No, population density, we're fine." It's just most of the population lives in very small part of the country. The big poodle, yes, is here to teach. Oh, good boy. Right. So, New Zealand, good exclusive economic zone, good commitments again. And again, all these countries you have to think about are trading nations. They are dependent on the global trade network, retaining, broadly speaking, the same. Which is useful, but also means they have commitments whether they want them or not. Miles McCaster, getting the F-35 for us is huge. Once it's over, any ships on water won't know they're being tracked by a fighter jet or not. Depends on what generation radar those ships have. Let's be honest. The F-35 is good, and it's going to be very, very good. But now the holy grail for everyone developing radars is going to be how far away they can detect the F-35. And it's not a blanket invisibility cloak it's got. Thank you, Galswood. Yeah, he popped in here. Do you want him to come up, Mum? Your mummy's looking for you. Back in a second. His mummy is looking for him. And the only way we're going to have to get him to there is to carry him up. There we go. Right. Sorry about that, everyone. Slow an intervention of poodle kind. Now, Amber. Okay. Yes, the fluffy research assistant was hiding from Mum, who wanted to brush him. Right then. So, getting into this. Next one is, of course, the UK. They do help as personal trainers, Drakenred. They do help as personal trainers. What do you drink there, Doc? Iron Brew. So, this is the UK. And as you can see, there are a lot of legacies going on there in terms of commitments. The fact is, the UK does have a presence in the Pacific. The UK has a presence in the Indian Ocean, disputed as it might be, but it's still there, with exclusive economic zones. They have commitments in the Antarctic, and all these are the Falklands, South Georgia and Sandwich Islands. You have the islands which go up the Atlantic. So Britain has a lot of commitments. This is important, but Britain is also one of its where it sustains its population and has such a large population, despite being territorial in terms of landmass. One of the smaller of these groups is by being integrated into the global trading network. We are dependent on our alliances and on the trading network going as it is. This is what you have to remember. Now, if I'm going to explain a global trading network to you, I usually start off with a pencil. I go into a shop and I buy a pencil. The shopkeeper tells me a price. I accept that price. I purchase it. It goes away. It's fine. But if I go into the shop and I go, no, I don't want to pay that price, I have two options. I can go and find another shop where I can find it for perhaps a different price, which is fine under the global system, or I can take it. Or a third option is I can stand outside the shop and I can block other people going in and out of the shop until they give it to me for the price I want. Now, the last two options are problems because within a country, those will be sorted out by the police and law courts. Once it starts happening in international relations, it's between countries. Sorry, Spiddy. I thought you were a mosquito. Now, when you have those scenarios going on, when you have people starting into, that's when you have a breakdown in international relations. So, for example, when you had Iran a few years ago de facto blockading the Straits of Hormuz against British shipping and the Royal Navy having to escort ships through, that was one of those scenarios going on. Britain needs the global markets to function. Britain needs the international trade to be functioning and running as it's supposed to be. Otherwise, they have problems. When there was the issues in the Suez Canal, the Evergreen issues, that caused problems for the British economy. With the great economic change that's come due to COVID, that caused problems for the British economy because the British economy is set up to work in the world as it is. Now, when there are problems, they cause adjustments, but those adjustments can take time to filter through, and they're never going to be without cost. The whole point of Britain when it's talking about strategic security is that it's trying to minimize the cost of those disruptions and minimize the disruptions. So the disruptions, when they happen, are due to natural events, not other powers playing around with the economy to suit themselves. It's the United Kingdoms of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Hence, it's the United Kingdoms of Great Britain because it's Scotland's a kingdom, England's a kingdom, Wales is a principality, and Northern Ireland is an interesting scenario. Ron Cash. Russia is pestered by drones. Dr. Clarke is pestered by mosquitoes. They're dying. Language, Glenn, but yes. Let me just point this out before we get into. Always be very worried about anyone who says they can directly show how much your current taxation is paying into other countries or into other parts of your country. In the UK, we have something called the Barnett formula. Now, this has often caused an issue, but one of the realizations is the Barnett formula is put in place because of, and I have to put this politely, the Barnett issue is put in place because it's how you adjust the payment scheme for various levels of government. Scotland's always had slightly more levels of government than the rest of the country. And one of the issues you have going through, led to the Barnett formula, is because you had the Scottish heavy industry, etc., was critical to the British economy, but they didn't have the population base to justify to pay the support for the maintaining the infrastructure level to support that industry. So basically, the Barnett formula is about sustaining the educational and transport infrastructure necessary to support the industry, which is crucial to the wider areas of the British economy. I know we like to believe it's about healthcare and sustaining all sorts of nice and lovely things in Scotland, but it really isn't. It's about maintaining the roads and the schools, so we have the people coming out of schools who can work in those industries where they need, if they needed to, as they needed to, and the roads, so we can get in the stuff there and that back, and the railways and those things. That's sadly what it often is. And often, when you're talking about larger, expansive areas, you still need to get through them. You still need the roads and infrastructure, but do they have the population to maintain? And just one of the things when you're dealing with road planning, etc. Right. So, do you, if you're maintaining roads, do you tax get the base the money for the roads on the people who live around the roads or the people who are driving through them? And if the people driving through them do not live in that area, how do you tax them for using those roads? Now, you couldn't put in a toll system, which is what some states do, i.e. Germany, etc. They'd like to put in toll roads, and That's a perfectly viable option if you want to choose that. But some use a system of general taxation. But how do you judge whether that's fair or not? Because you can go, well, these people in Surrey are paying for the roads in Cornwall. That's true. But the roads in Cornwall are critical for maintaining Falmouth, Culdrose, and also for all the people in Surrey who go on holiday down to Cornwall and come back. So you need those roads. But the trouble is, the people in Cornwall make a far smaller population and a far smaller tax base than the people in Surrey. That's why we have those governments to sort those things out. Always be careful. And this is speaking as someone who I've said before, I'm the former Conservative borough councillor. But I'm very, very worried about the people who like to speak about small government stuff. Because I sometimes look at them and go, but what are you really talking about? Hi, Strider. Thank you, McCaskill. Who are the monarchs of Scotland? That would be the Queen. It's monarch of Scotland as well. Ireland is an issue. Technically, Northern Ireland again is the Queen. It's the Queen, Northern Ireland. And Wales, it's the monarchy. The Queen is the head of Northern Ireland, and then Prince Charles is technically the Prince of Wales, who owes his allegiance to the Queen, who's the Queen of England. So far, I've killed a lot of mosquitoes this evening. They're all after my iron brew. Again! How many mosquitoes am I going to kill this evening? I know I should close my door, but I like the freeze being open. You're not getting my iron brew. So, Australia. Australia has an interesting history. Australia as an armed forces is pretty darn... How do I put this? Okay. If you want the caricature of the small elite forces, which will tend to be used as hard-hitting assault forces, you have got the Australians. They tend to be fairly innovative, fairly quick thinking, fairly adaptable, and fairly capable. And here is a Bathurst-class corvette, of course. Well, sloop. Now, one of this poster, and it's critical of the show, is it sort of goes, look, this is the security zone of Australia. And the security zone for Australia is we have to defend the ocean around. That's something that's been understood for a while. Out. Missed that one. Annoying, it dodged. Go away. Thank you. Dead. Thank you. Austria has toll roads. Germany doesn't have toll roads. That was a massive political disaster. Yeah, well, you know, it happens. Kind of like Cardiff pays for Pembrokeshire roads because they all holiday there. Then you have the Rangers, which need access for heavy armour. Mm-hmm. And sure, India has a combination of the road taxes. If you live near a big road, a marginal amount gets added into your property tax. Simultaneously, most large roads have tolls based on brackets or distance. It's paying for these things which is the problem, okay? You have to work out a fair way to pay for them. And the thing is, it's always a case of, do you pay for it because you have access to it or because you use it? The idea of general taxation is you're paying for it because you have access to it. You have access to a common standard of education across the country. You have access to a common standard of healthcare across the country. You have access to a common standard of roads across the country. Those are good things. And there's a reason they're good things. It's good for your economy if they're there. They provide a basis. Let's be honest, you do not want to be the industry which is continually having to pay other people for access to things. Hmm. Highways are construction projects to put skyscrapers to shame. Paying for them is a huge pain for everyone. Yep. It's all fun. It's all fun and games. But Australia has a strong history of having fairly decent armed forces, and they need them. Now, admittedly, they have lost wars to emus. I know that's depressing to think about, but, once they came to a sufficient agreement with the emus that they wouldn't hassle them as long as they didn't, the emus didn't take over the whole country, it's fine. One of the things that is interesting about the Australian Armed Forces is they have gone up and down quite regularly over history. And they grew to a huge size Model 1, depressed quite quickly, grew to a huge size of Model 2, managed to go down, but actually stayed fairly consistent. They even maintained carrier forces for quite a while. Then they got rid of them in 1982, and when they shifted back from policy of forward defence. Now, it's interesting to note that basically they're returning to a policy of forward defence without admitting it. And one of the things I often point out is that Australia starts to drink the Kool-Aid of the end of the Cold War before the Cold War ends. The idea war's a choice, and you don't have to. You can defend close to Australia. Once you get rid of the aardvarks, once you get rid of the carriers, you're basically accepting that you're going to be defending very close to Australia. So basically, you're presuming that you're not actually going to have to do it. Because if you actually have to defend that close to Australia, that you're in range of F-18s and the Collins class SSKs, etc., and their operating habits, you are well within strike range of Australia. And I'm not talking strike range of hypersonics. I'm talking strike range of most cruise missiles. We were having an interesting talk in Bill Trumps the other day, and it came out today because it was supposed to come out yesterday, but it turned out I'd programmed the wrong date in it. And one of the things we were discussing was the fact that you could theoretically launch some subsonic cruise missiles from Darwin, design assume a cruise missile that could do that, that could go and attack targets in the East China Sea. You don't want to be defending against that from close to your shore. And soon, building cross-national infrastructure is a nightmare in the current age. Can you imagine trying to build another Trans-Canada railway or highway or railway across the USA? That would be certainly fun. Andrew, to me, the EMU defense system is only a defensive system. It would be useful in some offensive operations, perhaps. If I'm fairly certain that we have agreed with Australia that if they allow EMUs to deploy on their ships further abroad, that is the equivalent of sending a nuclear weapon. Thank you, Glenn. Enjoy the books. Fighting wars against crows are fun. So, Australia's military strategy and scenario is kind of changeable as it goes through history. They get better at certain points, they get worse at certain points, and honestly, there isn't really a political party which is necessarily good or bad for defense. You also have to remember quite a lot of Australian history and strategy comes down to we want to build this on Australia. We want to build it on Australia. Australia is a country always in search of, I would say, not so much employment as independence. A legacy, perhaps, of being a colony. But it is certainly something which is critical for them, that they want to be able to build their own. And this has been a feature of Australian defence policy for a long time, which means their projects often seem to cost more because one of the troubles is because they tend to have a small military, they tend to have a lot of what I would call boom and bust economics when it comes to defense procurements. In that they will have a boom period where they're building lots of stuff, and then they'll be building nothing, so everything disappears, and then they have to rebuild that infrastructure, they have to rebuild that knowledge base, they have to rebuild everything to build it up again, which is why it costs so much. Which is why people from around go, it would be cheaper to buy it from abroad. Well, it would be. It would be a lot cheaper. But then you're also not sustaining your own industry or as independence. You're sustaining someone else's. Which, again, is basically what Britain was doing. You know, half the reason Britain had allowed and encouraged its dominions to have navies and have the forces they did was because they tended to place their orders, especially for larger items, like cruisers, with Britain, which employed British industry and British infrastructure, when at the expense of someone else other than the British government and the British taxpayer, which the British government really liked. Then we have Canada, once owner of the world's third largest navy. Craig, 55. Best books for learning about the Royal Navy. There are so many. Hill Norton has some good Oxford history of the Royal Navy and a few other things that are worthwhile looking at and reading, I think. Yeah, Hill Norton's books. They're probably the best generic ones to start off with looking at the Royal Navy. Cascadian, Clarke, based on what you said in regards to Australian doctrine and close in defence, I'm actively trying to change that with nuclear submarine program or changing doctrine overall. I think possibly the submarine program is reverting to the old other defence in depth scenario, and I think it's probably sensible. Control. If Australia and Britain went ahead with the sale of Invincible 903, would the RAN have tried to replace it with a QE class or downsize QE? How does that fare in the strategic situation? God only knows. Sorry, excuse the French there, but yeah, there are. It depends on so many things about Australia. If they had got an Invincible class, and Britain had ended up building a fourth Invincible, because probably we would have at that point, and especially if the Falklands War had still happened. So if we'd end up selling Invincible at we'd have ended up probably selling Sea Harriers to the Australians as well, in which case they'd have been a fellow Sea Harrier operator, and who knows what would have happened. It depends if it survives. If it survives the various reviews and serves 20, 30 years, then they might have gone for a Queen Elizabeth class, they might have gone for a Canberra class with Harrier F-35 capability. There are all sorts of options. Yep. Canada once had the third largest navy, and very few of them were cruisers. This is Uganda, which, of course, changed names and served in Canadian Navy for a while. Do you think, well, was the third place number of hulls or tonnage? Hulls and tonnage. Because they literally had so many hulls. They had all the escorts. And they're in many ways, the Canadian Navy is created to fight the Battle Atlantic. Their entire job is fighting the escort war. Could we see Australian carriers again if that's the case? That would take a lot of investment and a lot of infrastructure to actually get that. And Shumack, well, it probably depends on if it becomes viewed as a white elephant. Well, that's the trouble, because, as I've said before, one is equivalent to none. It's pretty much is a white elephant. Two is a capability most of the time, because usually one's available. Three is a guaranteed capability, because there's always one available. Four is a guaranteed ability, because one's always at sea. Five, usually you've got two available. So this is the point. When you're talking, when you're going through those operation scenarios, what are you actually building? Which is one of the reasons why the Hobart class 3, Canberra class 2, Queen Elizabeth class 2, Type 45 6. These are very small numbers, and they get to say, "Oh, these ships are so much more powerful than the previous ships." But the trouble is, a ship might be more powerful than its predecessors. It can still only be in one place at a time. It's the same for the US Navy. Ships can still only be in one place at a time. If we consider the US Navy currently is operating on a 1-to-3 ratio of deployment. Yeah, at the end of World War II was pretty much operating on a 1-to-5 ratio of deployment. That's a peacetime deployment level. 1-to-3 is pretty much wartime levels. 1-to-3, that ratio is what we consider wartime levels of deployment. If your fleet's consistently operating on 1-to-3 in peacetime, you're in trouble. Only 64. How many Nimitz class are there? From memory, there are 10 Nimitz class. And there's currently one active Gerald Ford class, theoretically. I'm not sure I'd really consider it active. One going through commissioning, one sort of one in building, one on order, sort of thing, roughly. But Canada, they have a good history. Again, their armed forces were often the critical shock troops. And there is a reason for this. One of the things I often get by people is they go, "Oh, well, they're used as the shock troops because, they're expendable." It's not because they're expendable, trust me. Colonial, especially Dominion troops, were not considered expendable. They were considered good shock troops because they often had a strong esprit de corps, but also because, and this is going to sound terrible, they often had a higher level of fitness level. They had a higher level of fitness because they tended to live a more rugged and rough lifestyle. That's what they were considered. And so they took longer also getting to the front, so they had more time training in their units and all those things, and that tended to make them useful as the shock troops. Galen, what do you mean 1 to X? Is that C or import? Okay, so if I'm talking about 1 to 3 ratio, that means I have one ship in the operational area, one ship in transit, and one ship in refit. And those other two ships could also they could also be in training. If I'm talking about 1 in 4 ship ratio, then I can have one ship in one ship in on operational in the where it's doing the work, one ship in transit, one ship in training working up, and one ship in refit. Oh, these 3 ships will be in any combination of those things going through. And that's the thing, because refit takes time, because ships operate in a saltwater environment, which is trying to kill them the whole time. So you cannot go, you know what, I'm going to skip the refit, and therefore I have these ships available. You can't. You also have the fact that the crews are deployed away from home the whole time. They're not based, they don't have a family life, apart from when they come home. So if you constantly have a high tempo of operations of your crew being forward, that sounds great. Yes, we'll maintain a constantly high tempo. It wears out your personnel far more quickly. They have no home life, and they tend to leave the service more quickly. And that's fine. And they in a wartime, they'll put up with it because it's for the war, it's a national effort. But in peacetime, you wear them out, and you lose them, and you lose good quality people to other things. Imagine, you should do a short explaining ship numbers and their effects on naval capability operations. I might well do that. So you said 5 equals 2 available. What about 10? 10 usually equals 4 to 5 available. Usually. Now, again, the trouble is the US Navy tends to try and run these at a 3 to 1 ratio again. So they tend to have 3 to 4 available in terms of forward. And there's a difference between saying available and forward. Now, a ship is defined as available when it's worked up and is able to operation. A ship is described as being forward when it's on task. So, if I'm saying I've got 5 ships available, that means that there are ships that are worked up and ships that are forward on task. But if I'm trying to operate with 3 to 4 ships forward out of 10, I haven't got enough. Because it's the most I could be doing forward is roughly 3 and a third, so 4 occasionally, and 10. Right, New Zealand. Well, they have another historical. Again, traditionally smaller forces, their population isn't that massive. But again, contiguous forces, they would tend to be very effective and have a strong spirit. There is this is the lovely painting of HMS Achilles, and eventually HMNZS Achilles. And this is the photographic reality. This looks lovely, picturesque, Battle of River Plate. But New Zealand is involved in World War II from the beginning. And they're critical to it. Sanford Thompson. Well, when your country tries to kill you 3/4 of the year, you tend to be very stout, shall we say. Yeah, it does help. After all, would the Australian government have paid enough for 3 Invincibles plus Sea Harriers? No, I doubt that. And Dan Freeman, re-dominion forces versus British. The awful conditions for the urban working class in England led to a poor quality of recruits in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Yep. That they tended to have to feed up and sort out and do all sorts of things for it, too. they're not that poor a quality. It's just, it's going to sound strange. You have the average. It's going to sound strange. It's not so much poor quality. It's a lower average quality than the Canadian Australian troops. And when I say lower average, it's just a bit down. But you still had quite a few shock troops. But also then you have the fact that the British also produced their own shock troops from within their ranks as well. So you'd have the Highlanders could be used as Scottish shock troops. You had Cornish troops were often used as shock troops. If you work through the British have various units, and the Australians and the Canadians tend to be used as well. There's also a perception thing of feeling amongst the generals. That is a problem. There is a psychology that the others are better. And I said, Alex, solution to wearing out your crews too quickly with high tempo operations is blue and cold. Yes, in which case you have 2 crews per ship. That is a solution, but then you're going to be increasing your crew numbers and your personnel numbers. So yeah, you're going to have to you're going to have to pay for that, and that still doesn't support out the ship. The ship still needs to go into refit. And you also have to be quite careful and very thorough there to make sure maintenance doesn't get dropped between 2 crews. I know Britain's been dealing with this for quite a while, especially with HMS Montrose being forward deployed in the Gulf and working through that. And they have managed to maintain a high tempo of capabilities and operations, but they still have had issues they've had to deal with as it's been going on. Hello, dude, look, dude. Craig 55, is the UK Navy not in a dire mess these days? The UK Navy will be getting into, but it's not that bad a mess. It's got issues, but there's not massive problems going on there at the moment. It's just short of ships and funding. I bet the Malta class HMS New Zealand would have been adopted by New Zealand. I doubt it would have been actually adopted by New Zealand because, in the nicest way, I don't think New Zealand would be wanting to run a Malta class carrier. But I think they would probably have, how do I put this, ensured that she had a significant portion of Royal New Zealand Navy crew as part of their, and it would be sort of seen as a lovely posting or something. Perhaps by tradition, the executive officer would have been from the Royal New Zealand Navy. Andrew, would it be practice say 50% of your forces can be made ready most of the times, about 25% of your forces can be forward deployed as Vs? As long as those 56 of your forces ready are include the 25% to 30% of your forces. That's basically 25% to 30%. Basically, it's 25 to 30% of your forces can be forward deployed. Then a further 25 to 30% of your forces can be ready to deploy. It can be sort of available. But then the remainder of your forces, which could be as much as 40 to 50% of your forces, will be not deployable because they'll be going through refits, they'll be in a process of training, true transition, all sorts of things. There's also the fact that with a nation like Australia, their overseas forces were all volunteer. Theoretically, they were, yes. True, but a second crew is significantly cheaper than a second ship. Ooh, that's getting into all sorts of conversations, Melanie, because where does that second crew train up? You need to have facilities. In fact, what Britain tends to do again with Montrose is they run another ship back in the UK, and their crews swap over, and they put Montrose's next crew onto that ship to do the training and be operating on that and getting up, and then it just transfer the whole crew across. And then the Montrose ship crew come back to the UK. They go off for theirs. They go off. go off and disperse, and another crew joins that ship to train up and go out. So you end up with 2 ships and 3 crews of people. Plus, well, you need extra people as well for the shore postings and other things which support them. So, yeah, things don't work out quite as cheaply as you would think. Still, it is more cheaper than having 3 ships to do the role, but that only works as long as HMS Montrose herself is not damaged in any way to the point at which she's out of action. It works out cheaper in peacetime, yes, but once you lose the ship and you've got a load of crew sitting around there, but it takes longer to build a ship these days. It takes 2 to 3 years, so you've got crew sitting around who've got no ship. So at that point, you have to start asking yourself, well, should you have maintained some reserve ships for those crews to deploy to in case of war if you lose ships? Government, what about use of shock troops? Yeah, but mainly that's mainly their singing, which is the shock. Sorry, couldn't resist. Zulu, a movie reference. If anyone's not seen Zulu, that's it. That's any games are good, which teach you logistics and supply lines are you good, pretty useful. No, sorry, I didn't say second crew was cheap, merely cheaper than another ship. Yeah, but there are different ways you pay. As pointed out to, you then lose the second ship, which is useful. So, UK, Great Britain, Northern Ireland, traditional history. Well, it was pretty much one of the world's premier military powers for arguably 200, 250 years. It still, to this day, has a case to be made that it's not exactly that far down the scale of military powers in terms of capabilities. It's certainly not the same position it used to be, but once you get below China and America, becomes a very interesting question as to who's in number 3 position, who's in number 4, and who's in number 5. And the UK is probably up there somewhere, but it's working out who's exactly where and how you value it. Because if you want to base it on nuclear weapons, well, then one nation can be up there. If you want to base it on all sorts of scenarios, it gets complicated. But in capabilities, you would consider Britain, broadly speaking, and this is why I prefer to sort of start talking about this because it's far more easier to go through. You have got superpowers, and then you have global powers, powers with global reach. And honestly, Britain is probably one of the few with global sustainable reach because of the logistics system it builds into its forces. And that's the thing. That's basically the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, the Royal Logistics Corps, the Air Transport Command. All those things give Britain actually sustainable reach. Not necessarily the largest forces they can deploy, but that could be that could turn up. But the thing is, when it deploys them, it can actually support them there. Come on, I will say those who wish for peace must prepare war. Yep. Hello. What are you doing here? You come to say hello to people.
I'm walking.
You're walking.
Karen can't get her stuff.
Oh, right. Hello. Hello. Right on.
How long are we going to sit there? We're allowed to sit there.
How long would you like to sit here for, little fluff? It's one of the other problems sort of written is, honestly, traditionally we do spend a lot of money on technology in defence. This is another factor we have to factor into things.
Get on, so I can either take you with me or...
Okay. You want to go with Sissy or stay with me? Go with Sissy, okay.
World War II broke it. I would, to an extent, there is World War II and there are other issues. But yeah, the British tend to invest in technology. And the British have a history of building up their forces to be quite capable, but also investing in tech over numbers. Yes, in World Wars, they have expanded their numbers quite dramatically. And one of the things is, if you look at the Peninsula Campaign and various other things, they have a history of doing this. But they like to keep their forces not massive, but not too small either. One of the issues for Britain is that it is, to an extent, as said, incredibly dependent upon the global economic markets and the trade. And this has been shown in world wars, but also previous Napoleonic wars, etc. Britain has to protect the movement of goods because its economy is entirely dependent on the economic goods, because its economy is arguably to extent dependent upon the servicing of debt. Britain has moved from a mercantilist to a capitalist economy over many years, and you of course have to service debt by paying interest, occasionally repaying parts of the balance, but mainly by repaying the interest, and that means you need to have goods moving around that you can tax. So for Britain, keeping its economy going even in wartime is always critical. In World War II, this caused the creation of certain areas to sort of, for example, Malaysia, etc., which were used to try and maintain sterling zones to try and sort of keep the sterling the finances going. That's an idea, but it does cause issues. It's things they have to work out, and it's things that you have to consider that it works hard. It works hard to maintain, but it means there is a constant contest between, to an extent, the armed forces and the Treasury over how best to defend Britain's interests. The Treasury will always put this interest as being a strong economy, which is, from a certain perspective, quite true. And they view the best way to maintain a strong economy is to restrict government spending to just those things which are essential. That has long been the British Treasury's perspective, which means the British Treasury is the biggest arguer against spending money on anything, at any time, any place. This, however, means historically and traditionally, the British government, British forces have never been prepared for any war they've ended up in. In 1939, they're preparing for war in World War II. They're preparing for, well, they think war's going to be 1942 or later. So they're preparing on that basis because that goes back to when officially the 10-year rule was dropped, 1932, unofficially dropped in 1937. The Treasury started actually letting out the money. So we could go to World War One, where again the British military was caught unprepared. They had the Haldane reforms. They had various things going on in the Admiralty, various dreadnought programs. But let's be honest, the British government had dropped the ball again because, in classic example, HMS Dreadnought is built, and then they take ages before they order not even the Invincibles, but not just the Invincibles, but any 4 more dreadnoughts or dreadnought level ships. They take a time to get round to it. Whereas what you really need to do was jump straight in and use the advantage to build up an advantage, which is why Germany felt they could catch up on all sorts of things. So there is a constant trouble with these things going on. Hello, Ingenious Iron. Indigenous Iron. Hello. Malaga, to be fair, no one's ready for War in 39. Nope. No one's ready for the Falklands in 1982. No one's ready for anything. Never ready. Never ready. So, excuse me, fast-moving Taft has just gone past. Officially, the Tafra is a lot faster than my sister. The Tafra had spotted that the gates to the lower part of the garden were being left open, and he was going investigating. Of course, the gate to the lower part of the garden includes the areas of the garden where we'd rather the dogs not go. When I say areas we'd rather not go, i.e. things like a mulch patch, etc., which they like to roll in. And Mum doesn't like walked into the house. Ah, fun times. Okay, Jane. Andrew, interesting. Well, CV passum parabellum. Those who seek peace should prepare for war. And as you said, while you should prepare for war to have peace, very few nations in history have actually been prepared when said war starts, unless you're the aggressor. Will you be better ready? No, let's be honest. In World War II, the aggressor was not better ready than the aggressor. Those who agree and aggress that. He didn't know there would be war in 1939. He really didn't. So, with that, without getting the face, what are we currently looking at, and what are we currently talking about in terms of the Australian Navy? Current programs and what they're sort of going to be doing for looking at. I have no idea what that's doing. Anyway, leaving that to one side. Currently, the Australian Navy is pursuing a policy of what can only be described as we're going to build this at home, which makes sense. The Australian military is trying its best to adapt to the scenarios within the existing structures, and that's the trouble. You're having to almost rethink all of your previous decision making, and it's going to be having to be rethought again because you're in a time of strategic flux and a time of technological flux. And when I say a time of technological flux, I mean you've got all sorts of new technology, which isn't so much coming into existence, but is becoming more affordable to the level at which it's sustainable affordability. They have limitations on them. And for example, if we're sort of looking at this current sort of build, they built 3 of the Hobart class. And because they realized they don't have enough air warfare capability, that's caused ricochets into the Hunter class, the Type 26s. In that they're taking an ASW frigate and basically trying to jam on as much anti-air warfare capability as possible while still maintaining the anti-submarine warfare capability. And they're doing that, and this is one of the things okay. One of the great advantages in Type 26 in terms of the modularity and the systems built into its open architecture systems is you can increase the power supply. You can put in more power generation capability, especially as you're expanding a ship. And honestly, they really should have just gone with the expanded model. It's also an interesting thing that you cannot directly compare the costs of the Type 26 in the UK to the Hunter class to the Canadian Surface Command. Why? Because UK, they're pretty much reusing the infrastructure already built for the Type 45s, already existent for the Type 23s. They're modifying and upgrading it, but they've got a huge amount of existing infrastructure already in place. They have done not much of a better job, but just enough of a better job in terms of sustainable manufacturing and continuing manufacturing of shipyard and ship construction, that they are able to reap from that benefits in terms of producing ships. It's cheaper for them, although they are still building at a far less than an economical rate of production. This is going to have an impact across the costs. But you have Australia-made decisions like the Canberra class. They chose the Canberra class. I mean, seriously, they look like a box with a bow stuck on, but we'll leave that to one side. we'll leave that to one side. They decided on them, and they decided they would build them without F-35 capability. So they are built entirely, whilst they have a ski ramp on the front, which they left in because it was part of the structural design, and honestly, it would have been more difficult to get rid of it. They haven't actually got the capability to operate F-35s. And to build it back in would be almost as expensive as building a new ship. It really would. To build in the capability to operate and sustain F-35s, which depends on, it requires a weapons loadout, magazine changes, all sorts of things to be built into the ship, and well, basically built back into the ship after having been designed out of the ship, would be almost as expensive as building a whole new ship. But these were procured in a time when Australia was very much wars of choice, but also very much, you could argue, considering what was their likely threat. And honestly, once you sort of start looking at the Hobart class, etc., they're not thinking about a peer conflict. They're thinking of joining in for allied warfare against possibly North Korea, possibly Iran, possibly some of the Gulf sort of scenario. They're not thinking about actually fighting a peer war. You know why you can say that? Because if you're building in 2s and 3s, you're not thinking about fighting a peer war. You've got enough for theoretical generation of capability, but the reality is different. And the addition of AA systems does explain distance increase and systems differences, as I had earlier. Yeah, basically, it's once you stuck in a huge heavy radar up the top. I think 12 Hobarts would be better. How are you going to sustain 12 Hobarts? That's everyone. Yes, it'd be lovely to have 12 Hobarts, but it's not going to be sustainable, is it? They haven't got the economy. They're spending 2% of their GDP on defense. That's fine. If they upped it to 3, they could probably build more. But honestly, in terms of Hobarts, you wouldn't want 12. The British should probably have had 12 to 13, possibly as many as 14 or 15 Type 45s, especially if they'd gone for a modified Type 45 with Mark 41 VLS built in from the beginning and slightly more VLS tubes built in from the beginning. That would have been sensible, with a Seawolf, Seawolf Seaceptor farm back along the ship on the top deck somewhere, and 41 and about 32 cells of Mark 41 VLS and at least 48 cells of silver forward. That would have been the sensible Type 45 to have built 12 to 15 of. For the Hobart, the Australians needed 6 to 7. They really did need 6 to 7. Not 12. They can't sustain 12. But if you could have 8, that's really good, because you could have 2 squadrons of 4, one base on each coast, so you could usually have 2 available each coast, and that would to be sustained. But if you could have 7, you can probably achieve. Well, as I said earlier, with 5, you can always achieve the 2. You can guarantee 2 availability of 2. With 7, you can usually guarantee the availability of 3. With 7, you can usually guarantee. So you would have 1 available on each coast, and 1 else probably forward deployed somewhere. So you could sustain that with 7. 8's better, but so you're not talking about 12. You're not talking about a massive increase in numbers. You are still talking about doubling their numbers. And that's still expensive. But the thing is, again, ships tend to get cheaper the more you build them. I.e., they get cheaper to build, they get cheaper to sustain, because you have a little more crew numbers, and you have a critical mass of personnel maintained. It's also easier to provide incentives to maintain to keep personnel employed, because you can provide more easily. You can provide promotion more easily to the good quality personnel. Actually, the RNZN was also all them defend Australia until help from the US and UK. Is it too small for that? Basically, the RAN is looking at, there are two roles. They have to provide enough force that they can join into an allied force, because they depend on allies, because their population isn't large enough to sustain really enough forces to defend the entire country. But also, they have to show willing to defend their forces, because in the nicest way, America and Britain might love Australia, but we're not going to. But neither of them are going to write blank checks to defend Australia if Australia isn't willing to step up itself. And that's the big problem when you're talking about alliances. There is an old thing: God helps those best who help themselves. Well, it's the same thing with alliances. Alliances help best those who can best help themselves. So if you have a capability, if you have strong forces, so you are useful to your allies, they are most likely to help you. Allies who are net benefits to an alliance are more likely to receive assistance from that alliance than allies who are net drains. Oh, goodness knows what names we'd use for the RN Type 31s if they got 4 more. But I think they're going for Type 32s now, Snapton. Hello, Greg Murray. Canada. Currently, Halifax is our king, and they've got this is one of the sustainment ships they're building. Canada, their current force structure is interesting because they've got the Wolf class, which are coming into service, and they're of course looking at the Canadian Service Command. But they have a tradition of having what I would call very heavily overarmed frigates or destroyers. They have whatever the smallest acceptable name or ship is, and then it's heavily overarmed. You must remember, this is a navy which was built around largely tribal class destroyers, and they were built around that because they were so good. They were good for that. The tribal class destroyers were the good compromise for Canada. They have a larger population than Australia. But again, their population, as has already been discussed, is largely based in the Ontario area. It is very centralized. There's a bit on the coast, and the Quebec and that sort of area, but Ontario area is where there's quite a lot of population base. Canada needs its navy to be strong, but they also have to sort of balance things. Like, they need ice-breaking capabilities, and honestly, a frigate with a bow-mounted sonar is never going to be an ice-breaking tool, because the bow-mounted sonar is going to go. They also have to, even more than Australia, have a 2-fleet policy. Why? Because in Australia, whilst it's theoretically an island, even though it's a massive island, and therefore they can theoretically bring the fleets round. For Canada, well, you have 2 options. You could either try and go the northern route, which is usually iced up, and you're going to probably need an icebreaker at any point of the year to escort you through. Or you can go south to Panama, through the Panama Canal, and then come up to the Pacific coast. That's kind of a problem. So Canada has the problem that whatever force structure you have to basically divide by 2. And half will be on one coast and half will be the other coast. So whatever strength you have is going to be divided in 2, and the odds of you having the second half turning up when you need it is not going to be quick, and it's not going to be easy, because they're going to be doing things on the other coast. And that's before you consider any forces up north. So Canada is constantly having to try and balance their commitments in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, and in the high north. And they try their best. And they try their best, but they have roughly, as of 2020, 67,492 active personnel, 36,381 reserve personnel, and they're spending roughly 1.3% of their GDP on defense. Now, that's of 2021. Remember, they are also a NATO member, so they are technically supposed to be spending 2% of their GDP on defense. Now, you can say, yes, they've got America as their next door neighbor, but if you consider how successful and how capable Canada is on 1.3% of GDP, imagine what they could be doing on 2% of GDP. Again, though, they face the same problems because, as Australia, but even worse, because when they're building ships, everyone automatically compares them to the next door neighbor. Next door neighbor is America, which is building ships by the dozen. And they're going, oh, ours aren't as capable as, I don't know, Zumwalt class or Flight 3, whatever, Burke, or this, or on paper, or this thing, and they're costing us about so much. Oh, we must be being overcharged, or there must be corruption. No, there isn't. That's the cost of doing business when A, you're building the ships yourself, and B, you're building them to the Canadian version design. And that's the thing about the Type 26. It's an architectural thing. It's Canadian version design, it's the Australian version design, it's the British version of the design. And that's fine. Actually, that's sensible because it saved a lot of money for all three nations. That's right. I heard they'd be selling the Halifaxes to Argentina. Well, if they do, they do. Argentina's always being rumoured to buying stuff, though, and so far they haven't managed to afford to buy anything other than some tugboats. And South Johnson, divide by three. Remember the Arctic Ocean. The trouble with dividing your fleet by three is you're going to need completely different ships to operate in the Arctic than you will in the North Atlantic and the Pacific. There's going to be completely different ships. So honestly, you have one force you divide by two, and then you're going to need, for the Arctic operations, it's completely different ships. So basically, the Wolves are going to be it. And you would need to produce a modified version of the Wolf class that could actually carry some heavy weapons. And then we have New Zealand. Now, the New Zealand Navy gets a lot of shtick. They really do. The New Zealand Defence Force probably more than most in terms of, gets more shtick. But the Navy is not bad. They are very highly trained. They are very capable. And honestly, I have a lot of affection for the Royal New Zealand Navy. They work hard. Their active ships are a couple of Anzac frigates, of which I think you can see both here. HMNZS Takaha and Tamana. They have Protector class offshore patrol vessels, Otago and Wellington, which I think also in the picture. They have HMNZS Canterbury, which is this large multi-role vessel in the front, which I always consider is sort of modeled on the Absalom class, though probably would have been better served by actually building an Absalom class in terms of military capability. They have hydrographic ships. They have a oiler. They have lots of capabilities sitting there. But the thing is, they also don't have a massive population. Again, one of the conversations I often have with people is they're going, okay, what happens if Scotland goes independent of the UK? That's a whole debate and a whole thing. So far, every time Scotland's been asked, they've decided they're not going to stay in part of the UK. But one of the things that often comes up is, what kind of military are they going to sustain? Well, in the nicest way, have a look at New Zealand, because that's pretty much what you've got the capability of if you're Scotland and if you're independent. That's your military. That's what you can probably sustain, because that's what you're going to have the balance to sustain. And also, once you start, let's consider New Zealand maintains this navy, but yeah, New Zealand Air Force. That's a sort of different scenario. If any service has suffered a lot in New Zealand, it's their Air Force. And their Air Force current strength, well, Their current aircraft are Augusta Westlands, Super Sea Sprites, and H-90s, which are all sort of for supporting their Navy. They have C-130s. There's some 757s. They have some Orions for maritime patrol. They have no fighters. They don't have UAVs, and this is not a critique. This is what they've decided because this is the funding they have. And they can afford to do it in a way because if we go back to here, if we look at New Zealand, who's within the airstrike range of them? It's New Zealand. It's Australia. And as far as they're concerned, the Pacific is an American ocean. It's an American lake. So who's going to attack them? The Americans aren't, and the Australians aren't. So they can afford not to have fighters. They can afford to make the decision to invest in other things. And that's a perfectly rational, logical choice to have made for the last 20, 30 years. You can say the world's getting more complicated and the world's more of a problem than it used to be, but that might well lead to them having to change. And them having to develop things. Ron Cash, is the HMS Canberra the most unstealthy ship in the world? Sadly, no. There are a few which are. It has more than one sister. I saw someone try to compare the Implacables to Essexes. That's always fun. Don't think so. We've been building a single ferry for like 8 years. Well, yeah, that's. I'm saying again, this is what you could afford if. We'll go around some. Whether they would actually have this is an entirely different matter. That depends on how viable you think it is. Prince Primark 359. Hello, Primark. Always interesting to have a Warhammer fan here. Handborn is a disaster response capability compared to military capability. Given handborn relationships with smaller island nations, New Zealand and Australia, is it actually more important? It's probably as important. And let's be honest, the military is often part of disaster relations capability. I would argue that's what Canterbury is, etc. The trouble is, here is the thing: if you go, okay, we're going to say disaster response capability is more important than the military capability. That's a fine position to put, but that's a fine until you need the military capability. It's kind of like disaster. It's basically going, you know what? Which is more important, having the police service or the ambulance service? I'm going to decide having the ambulance is more important than the police. Well, that's fine until you have a crime spree. Then you need the police. I'm going to decide the police is more important than the ambulance service. Well, then that's fine until you have disaster relief and you have a lot of people injured in a traffic accident. You need to get them to hospital. Then you need the ambulance service. Disaster relief versus disaster capability versus military capability is not an either-or subject. And this is one of the troubles you get into a lot of modern politics. You get things treated as, we can either have this or this. Well, the correct answer is you probably need both. The correct thing, the thing you have to work out is what is the ratio you need of both, and how much funding you should be allocating to both. And the moment you start setting it as a debate of we can have this or this, you set up a false dichotomy, which causes debate, aggression, and all sorts of problems. So Canada's big issue for both air and sea is the Arctic. Yeah, it is. And it's one of the reasons why the F-35 has been chosen, but I don't think the F-35 alone is a good solution for Canada, although it's probably the only option they could have gone with. And yeah, UK. So we've replaced 5 aviation ships with 2. Because wars were going to be only wars of choice, you know. It's only since Ukraine was invaded for the second time let's be honest, 2014 happened, although people didn't take much notice of it at the time, that people started going, hang on, perhaps we can't choose when wars are going to be. And the worry I have coming out of this is that the moment people are going to say, if Russia's sufficiently humbled, they're going to say, oh, now it's peace, and they're going to forget about China, which is a far bigger worry in many respects than Russia. Because, let's put it this way, Russia shows what happens when you get someone who could be stable, but becomes becomes more of a problem as time goes on, in charge of a country. And you can't base defense policy on what people are like now. You have to base it to an extent on what they could be like if things go wrong. Now, for democracies to go wrong, there tends to be points of play which are going to influence them. But for autocracies, even autocracies in a gerontocratic form, like we've got with modern China, you have to be careful, because it depends to an extent on the personality in charge and how they assess risk and how they judge their interests. It becomes a far more personal decision you're dealing with. And for Britain, as I've been over before, is dependent upon global trade. So whilst you can go here and go, you know what, these are Britain's commercial interests in the world, well, they're pretty far flung. But then you ask things like, well, how much British trade passes through the Taiwanese Straits? And how much trade passing through the Taiwanese Straits is Britain's economy connected to? I.e., that trade might never touch Britain, but does it have an impact on the London Stock Exchange, on the Lloyd's Registered Insurance and the listing of insurance firms? Are the goods, are the ships, are the personnel insured through Lloyd's and through the UK exchanges? These are all things which Britain has to consider. Thank you, Greg Murray, for becoming a supporter. Thank you. But this is this is where the world comes in, and this is where you have to start considering things. So this picture looks really good. We've got one flat top with F-35s on, and some helicopters, but we've got another one which is working out, but that means we've only got two, and as I've been over, one is white elephant territory, two is a capability normally, but that's as long as an accident doesn't happen on one that's actually available. Three is is capability, four is availability. We went from having Argus, Ocean, Invincible, Illustrious, Ark Royal. Yes, none of them were as individually capable as these two ships. In fact, any group of them were arguably not as capable as these two ships, either one of these two ships. However, the fact is we replaced 5 ships with 2. And that's a problem. Which is one of the reasons why I'm campaigning for LHDs for the commando, for the littoral strike groups, the commando forces. Because I think if we had to go to sort of 4 and we have 2 strike-orientated platforms and 2 amphibious-orientated platforms, but the amphibious-orientated platforms can support limited strike, and the strike carrier platforms, these ones, can support limited amphibious. I think that's the most sensible thing for a navy, for a medium power. I'd also argue that looking into things like UAVs for them makes sense, because then we can actually get 2 air groups functioning for our carriers, because we're not going to buy enough F-35s to sustain 2 air groups and sustain the strike force, which the RAF wish to have a deployable strike force, which makes sense. Now, I could get into the whole army scenario, but I've been trying to avoid most of the army stuff because it sounds like bashing when you're a naval historian to point out the problems the army's having. There are problems the navy's had as well. All the British Armed Forces have had problems with delivery and of various projects. One of the things, the cost of the carriers is often brought up, but you have to remember they were paid not to build. They were paid to actually just freeze them in place during construction, which brought up the cost. And honestly, we ended up paying the cost for building 3 carriers, or actually more than 3 carriers, and taking delivery of 2. So we could have had a 3rd Queen Elizabeth class for the amount of money we spent paying for them not to be built. But if you built 3, you would have had to build another docking facility. You'd probably have to build it up in Liverpool because that's the only probably suitable dock area you could have actually economically built it. And you would have to start justifying your carrier battle groups, etc. Because we currently have 6 Type 45s, which is not enough to sustain three of these size carriers. Because each of these carriers, when they go into battle into operation, needs at least 2 Type 45s, 2 Type 26s, or Type 23s with them, along with allies, to sustain a proper battle group. And that is Britain's main problem. It has built a force which is a very good nucleus force for deploying around the world. But one of the things it needs is to actually make that military deployable is they need allies to build into it. Because we haven't invested enough in escort force. But then people go, well, we should have built one less carrier and more escorts. Well, it doesn't work like that, because then you would have had actually less need for escorts, because even 2 is better than 1. And as I said, 3 would have been better than 2. Indigenous Iron. If Scotland became independent, what type of small diesel subs could you see them shopping for? Oh, I don't see them getting subs. They might consider going German subs eventually, but I doubt they get any subs at all. Because they probably go with something which is an they probably go with a UUV construct if they go for anything underwater capability. I honestly don't see Scotland getting anything other than patrol ships if they go independent. I don't see them sustaining it. They would be basically Scotland would be like a combination of probably something like Ireland's armed forces, and Ireland's armed forces are pretty much dependent upon Britain actually protecting them. That's all their fishermen protecting them. In terms of their capability, is we have no fighters, so we can't really do our own air defense. We have nothing bigger than OPV, so we can't do anything other than maritime patrol. Cascade, Dr. Clarke, looking at the Australians' objective in the current day, are they looking in regards to the developing situation in China? Are they going to be able to meet the challenge ahead? They're certainly looking at it. Whether they're going to be able to meet the challenge ahead depends on how they work it and how they look at it. Leonard, hello. What do you think of the future Turkish drone aircraft carrier? Is it something RN or USN will want, and are drone carriers the future? I think for at least the immediate future, we're going to be looking at hybrid carriers of ships having mixed uncrewed and crewed aviation complements. Eventually they might be entirely uncrewed, but I doubt it. Not for the major powers. There are advantages to having crewed aircraft. Yes, that's a risk, but you can mitigate the risk by having a mixture of uncrewed and crewed aircraft, loyal wingman style things, and other strike drones. How many carriers would you say we need? Well, I wrote a paper about this a few years ago, and I said honestly we could justify having 3 carriers and 4 LHDs with ski ramps that could operate the same aircraft, as that would give you basically the core of 7 task groups. But that was me being very much pushing the case and pointing out all the risks we had and all the issues we had. At the moment, if I would be quite happy to settle for a 2 and 2, but I'd prefer a 2 and 3 mix with 3 LHDs with ski ramps. Alex relaxed 5 with 2 and placed 5 with 2, and it only took how many years for capabilities to do it? 10 years. Leonard, is China perceived as more manageable just because of less nukes and more trade ties with the West, or do they actually less confrontational Russians? The former. It's money. The Trieste makes me very jealous. The Trieste is very good. The Trieste is what I would be building a modified version of for the UK. Jack Wright, do any of the RNs have low-cost ASW and AW platforms which can be built in less than a year? Nope. Vision, what if the UK, Australia rotated carriers out of the Indian Pacific? Would it make sense to the RAN to build a new HMS Melbourne? If they were all rotating jointly, they would still need more ships, because Britain still needs to defend itself. So the thing is, Britain can't afford to commit both carriers to supporting operations in the Far East, because it still needs a carrier in the Atlantic quite often. Carling has crewed, uncrewed, and there's optionally crewed. Yeah. JC, doesn't the US have a few carriers on mothballs that could be lent and modernized? No. No, it's really... And they require a lot more crew. Remember, the RN's carriers require, depending on how you read it, a fifth to a third of the crew of the US carriers. Now, the ones which can be lent, which theoretically the non-nuclear ones, and there's only one of those which is a museum ship, which is Midway. Forrestal class, they're all scrapped. All broken up. And then after that, it's Kitty Hawk class, which have all been scrapped or to be dismantled. And then we have the Nimitz class. Basically, the US have no spare carriers, but even if they did, if we consider Nimitz class carrier, requires as crew between 5,000 and 5,200, including air wing, whereas HMS Queen Elizabeth requires as crew, including airmen, 679 crew, air element, etc., and troops able to carry it up, sort of talking up to 1,600. So it's between a third and a fifth of personnel are required. That's a big commitment difference for them at that pass. Thank the fellows. Presumably, an independent Scotland will be protected from invasion by the UK because we wouldn't tolerate an aggressive land border to us. They'd have to hope. Basically, it'd be a case of we would have to be very, very good friends, because if they got problematic, it could be interesting. Why not? So, like, free Canberra class? Yeah, definitely. A free Trieste class. For the Australian New Zealand, surely a joint military makes the most sense for the point of view of resources. Nothing is getting to New Zealand except for Australia anyway. It could theoretically be viable, but doubtful, because they're both quite independent countries and they have very different foreign policies and very different governments. That's right. Carl, what percentage of time will a new RN carrier need to be in refit? There's all sorts of theories around that. But theoretically, with two carriers, you can always guarantee one availability based on their operational refit times. Not quite sure about that one myself. I think there's going to be some fudging, but we'll see. Wayne Borean, that's why Canada went with a cruiser style design and building all ships to it. We can't justify carriers, so we need maximum capability in one platform and lots of those platforms. Yep. Now, what would I like to see them do? Well, what I would like to see them do is work together as best they can. And when I say work together as best they can, is I don't mean do joint militaries, because honestly, I don't think joint militaries really works for any of them. I think what they need, and what they're sort of needing and really needing, is to work together on the design and creation of ships. The Type 26 class forms really a basis of the idea. And that's important to think about. what is the expensive part of construction of ships these days? It's maintaining the industry and maintaining the skills, but it's also the design and development. In fact, honestly, the design is, if we consider the Type 45 is a good example. They're often marketed, described in newspapers as £1 billion destroyers. The actual construction cost for building one, less than 400 million. The development costs is what makes it up to £1 billion destroyer. Because it was designed to be, development costs were designed to be spread over 12 ships, and actually ended up spreading over 6, which took them up to £1 billion destroyers. And also, let's be honest, it gets cheaper the more you build. So you say average cost for the first 6 was 400 million. If you had in another 6, you'd have probably dropped it down to about 250 to 300 million average across class, and you'd have taken that 600 million at that 3.6 billion development costs, roughly, and you'd have divided it by 12, so it'd be 300 million, so you'd have probably ended up with the 600 million pound destroyers. Not the billion pound destroyers. And this is the point about a lot of the stuff we're dealing with is it's the numbers thing. So if you can share development, this is a big thing with the Type 26s, which people aren't seeing. Is there's a lot of share pooling going on over the systems development, the architecture, the all the systems being built in the ships in terms of making them work together, which makes it more cost effective. Seth Johnson, Dr. Clarke, for Aaron, would you base it off for RNHD? Would you base it off the Wasp or American class? Base it off a Trieste class. We don't. The RN doesn't have the personnel numbers to be able to sustain a Wasp or America class, not unless they want to cry a lot. Wayne Borean ships. As for Scotland, they could buy some of our offshore patrol vessels in military configuration. Careful what Scotland needs. It could be interesting. Look, I love Scotland. As I said before, I've got lots of family for there, but it's what would they actually sustain? And it would be offshore patrol vessels. John Platt, it seems to me the United States has fleet carriers and the UK has light carriers. I'm not sure if at roughly 70,000 tons fully loaded, we can call an RN carrier a light carrier. If we call we tend to call it a strike carrier. The US tend to call theirs a fleet carrier. I'd say light carrier is a little bit lower down the spectrum than. Oh, another mosquito after my own brew. This is the good thing about having a big screen. It deals with them. It attracts the mozzies away from me towards the screen. But it's definitely interesting. Craig 55. Why do you get naval stuff? Long family history of naval service. Loved reading about it, so got into that. That was naval architect. Just like being a naval historian. Ended up getting a PhD in it. The whole chat has left me wanting a long form discussion stream in history and modern capabilities of the Indian Navy to it now. I might work on that at some point. So, basically, they need to work. My theory is they need to start working together on the things they can work together. So why not build an American or Italian design? I'd be quite happy to build a modified version of the Trieste. The reason you have to modify it is because the Italians have built the Trieste to suit them. And in many ways, that suits the Mediterranean and their solo ship operations. The British will be looking at a ship which was for more operating in the South Atlantic capabilities and high north. So you would want something with a slightly bigger. It would be based off that design, but it would be bigger, it would be modified, and it would be basically designed for what the Royal Navy needs it to do a bit more. So it would be a case of, similar design, but, not that dissimilar. You would be able to see its lineage. So, let me put some ideas out there. So, Commonwealth Submarine Program. And this is going to annoy a few people because I'm going to come up with a suggestion here. It's not just Australia which needs nuke boats. I know New Zealand doesn't it, but the Royal Navy, of course, British, of course, operate nuke boats. And I think Canada could justify nuke boats, although to replace the upholders. Now, it's going to be interesting to see how they view it, but if you consider for the Astute class, and presumably the SSNR, which is, I'm saying for the nuke, I've used the Astute as example here, but that I'm meaning for the future boats as well. They usually have a complement of roughly 98. The Virginias have a complement of roughly 135. Now, that doesn't sound like a massive difference, but it builds up. And that's something which the smaller navies have to watch. The US sustains the 135, and they sustain a large number of them, and that works for the US. They have the budget, they have the economy, they have the population to sustain it. Small numbers can build up once you're talking over many crew. So this is why I think producing a joint program is probably the best way to go. It would also mean that there is a pooling of resources and a sharing of technology in a way which sustains all three. Whether Canada would actually build its own submarines, or whether they'd do India style, which India's bought some of their nuclear boats from Russia and is building their own, is entirely up to the Canadians whether they decide it's worthwhile investing. It depends how many they build. It's not something they can do and build a small number. If you're going to build nuke boats, you need to build a significant number of them. And I think that's also what Australia is looking at. It's a case of, yeah, we want to have nuclear boats. Yes, we want to have this level of technology. Yes, we need this for the distances we're operating on. But it's an issue. The reason I think Canada needs nuke boats is I'm looking at the Arctic. As I said, they basically have 3 different naval needs. And the Arctic, almost entirely, they need submarines and aircraft. They need submarines for dealing with what's underneath the ice. And it's probably the best way for their operational capabilities. And they need aircraft for operating over the ice. The Wolves will do the patrol bit, but the moment you have fighting up there, you haven't really got warships which are built to be icebreakers as well. I knew how to. No scope in car, no scope for developing ships with France. There is a problem with working with France, and that's a problem which came with the Horizon frigate project. This is something people often come to me and go, "Oh, we need to do a European frigate project." And I go, "Yes, okay, we've done it before. What went wrong with it?" And they look at you and go, "We know." Well, the problems with it basically come down to is what do you want? You need to start thinking about what is the similarities. Britain likes to have. Britain builds a global fleet, a global operating fleet. So they have split ships off that operate on long range, have to be able to take a range of scenarios and a range of systems. That's part of British construction. The French, their fleet is more interesting. Okay, some of their ships are definitely global operating ships. Some of their ships really aren't. And one of the arguments you can get to into the Horizon frigate project versus the Type 45s is that the British really wanted the global operating destroyer. That was the capability they were looking for. There is actually far more strategic similarity for Britain to work with, and Canada to work with, and Australia to work with, and New Zealand to work with, if they work together. Especially as long as they operate on the policy of kind of like the Type 26, where they can work together and produce a common architecture, they do, but where they want to, they can modify it off to their own needs. So it's basically, yeah, we're building this class. They're the same class, but they're variants of that class. There's the Canadian variant, the Australian variant, the British variant. They have similarities, they have differences, but they can work together, and they have the areas they do have similarities in reduces our cost. So that's more the sort of structure you're arranging at, and that requires governments which have a deep understanding of each other. There are issues when you involve more nations. The more nations you involve, the more complicated it gets. And as I said, the reason I'm proposing this is with these nations is because they understand each other enough, and they get each other enough, and they have enough similarity. They have enough similarity in terms of their needs that it would work. That's why I'm putting it forward. We tried SSNs when I was in the RCN boats. Didn't work. I'd be tried to get SNs when they were in RCN. Didn't work. I'd be happy if we could get large AOP with mod batteries. The trouble is, there isn't really a large AOP going around. If you consider when that was the whole problem for the French when building the Barracudas for the Australians. The fact is, no one's really built a large SSK that can do those sort of operation scopes. The Japanese talk about it, but they're building it's not really the same thing, and what they're building, and they're good ships, but they're not really the same thing. The Germans certainly subs aren't. You know, there's the good example is the Germans vessels had trouble with the ranges between Australian bases, let alone going to the operation areas. And it's the same for, to an extent, the Canadians. The reason why they go with the upholders is because they were the only ones available at the time, and even the Brits admit they weren't really that good. They were being built as an insurance for the SSN production. And when the Cold War ended, they didn't have the money for the insurance anymore. Mm-hmm. No, Canada has a massive nuclear infrastructure, but it's politically unfeasible to build nuclear submarines. Australia has no nuclear infrastructure, but it's politically feasible to go nuclear submarines. Yeah, the thing is, I think one of the problems for America now is that saying Canada can't have nuclear submarines, they can turn around and go, well, you're letting Australia have them. So previously, yes, there has been a problem. And yes, I do admit America has been very pushy on stopping Canada getting nuclear boats. But I think the problem is now that they can't really do that and give Australia nuclear boats, and giving Australia nuclear boats is critical to their security infrastructure and critical to their alliances in the Pacific. So, yeah, they've kind of made that bed for them. So this is very much post the Australia decision. Thinking. You see, it's amazing number of ships you can budget for when you forgo unnecessary expenditure like healthcare. No, again, This is the thing I'm pointing out. This again, you can make similarities you can make spending sort of cases, but the fact is, the Canadian budget is 1.3% of the GDP. Under NATO, they're supposed to be 2% of GDP, so that's 0.7% of GDP, which you theoretically could play with. And I'm not really playing with that. I'm saying you can work it out and you can build decent subforce while still maintaining within that GDP scenario. In fairness to France, they will not comprise the center of their defense supply chain for the sake of cooperation. It is an issue. France focus on them, which is fine. That's their strategic autonomy, and you can understand and respect that. But it makes it an issue for cooperating with. When I was still serving, I took a course that was taught by Naval. So he said that sub officers who were trained in Britain and Canada could only get subs that the British had. They're usually fairly good with other subs as well. Why would the US be against Canada subs? Not so much against it as they've often been worried about Canada having an independent nuclear capability, because nuclear submarine capability, because again, there's the rules of the treaties of acquisition and those things and technology. Honestly, again, that's been the problem. It's been the treaty system, the treaty on nuclear technology transfer and all those things that have caused the problems. They've now got past that for Australia, so I don't see why they couldn't get past it for Canada. But it meant that they were sort of looking at leasing boats and all sorts of things rather than actually them having their own independent boats. IMC Legend 13H. We are increasing, but the Canadians are very, very reluctant to spend on large programs that don't have immediate return to the public. Defense is hard to explain to people with that mindset. It's an issue. But yeah. Commonwealth frigate programs. Actually, this is one which is quite sensible. We've already got the Type 26 going on. The British are going for a Type 26, Type 31 mix. A high-low mix, you can say. And who's a perfect candidate for Type 31s? That's New Zealand. They need to replace eventually their frigates. And about the time they need to replace theirs, they could slot in a couple builds in the UK. They could build them in New Zealand, but they're unlikely to. So probably Type 31s. But having a twin sort of frigate program, a capability, what I would call task group / presence frigate, picket / heavy frigate programs is a good scenario for the Commonwealth, for those nations to work with together, because they can fit around it. Selling this sort of thing to Canada and Australia is more of a difficulty, but actually you could end up getting more nations buying in to this sort of program if you have New Zealand, if you have other Commonwealth partners coming in. You could end up with having South Africa, you could end up having sort of other allied Commonwealth nations decide to get involved with the light frigate program. So they could be quite useful. Nice to run. Look, and don't get in. I'm not going to get into the Horizon project and some of the big issues on it, but safe to say I've worked with both the British project lead and my dad who were involved in it and talked about it with them. And there is a lot more than just lessons of the Falklands War, etc., being involved in it. A lot more. There were so many issues with the Horizon frigate project. It was being kept going by politics. There were big differences between what the British wanted and what the French and Italians wanted. So this is about the Kansas fleet. Not really. This is about how they can help each other. And it's not about building a combined fleet. This is about building, how do I put this? Building a sustainable procurement program. The thing is, if you're building a future frigate program, a program of ship design, etc., you have to start thinking, what are we building for? And a lot of the cost, as I've been going on about, of these systems is in the research and development. And that's where these nations can work together most. They can have common architecture, they can have a common framework design, and they can modify that design to their own particular needs. The Type 31, or Type 32, which New Zealand would have, will be very different to the Type 32 the British would have. Just like the Type 26 the British are going to have, is not going to be the same as the Australian type, the Hunter class, or the Canadian Surface Combatant. They're going to be similar architecture, common design, and common framework in their thought process, but modified to their own national needs. And that's fine. The trouble is, again, also you have to start thinking about numbers, because what can they sustain? And we've, again, been over this in populations. The British population is almost as big as the other three nations that we're talking about this combined. So you might sort of go, right then, they should all be building the same. They're never going to build the same numbers. They're never going to build the same fleet mix. The British are going to build a different fleet mix to the Australians, to the Canadians, because they also have different strategic needs. So they're not going to build the same numbers of the same types of ships. And they're not going to build even the same, really, and they're not going to build the same versions of the same ships either. But that's fine. That should be encouraged because that better suits their needs. But actually, by working together on the research and development, you can actually cut down a lot of the costs. Again, I go back to the Type 45s and I go, look, the cost of development was spread over 6 hulls. It cost this much. And that caused them to be billion-pound destroyers. Whereas if you're spreading the cost of development of the Type 26 over however many hulls all of the men end up building combined together, that saves money. Hello, Yickers. A lot of money. And then we have a Commonwealth destroyer program. Now, the thing is, the British are going to be building the Type 83s. Hobarts have not that long ago entered service, but they are probably going to be online for replacement about the time the British are sort of finishing building the Type 83s. And this is what China has. This is what now the comparison is, the Type 55. That's where you've got to start thinking about, the Type 52s, Type 55s. And you've got to start comparing them because destroyers are considered your big hitters. They're your big present ships. There's also the fact that for Canada, if there is a Commonwealth destroyer program, actually might be attracted to them. Now, I don't think, again, they'd be getting a baker's dozen of each them and Type 26s. They wouldn't be. But for Canada, maybe having a flagship for each coast would be viable, especially if the cost is brought down enough that, okay, we can afford it, and it gives us an extra ship for each squadron. So let's say they have 6 Type 26 for each coast and a Type 83 for each coast. Yeah, they only have a couple of Type 83s, but they're very useful, especially when they slot into Australia has, let's say, 3 or 4 Type 83s. And Britain has more Type 83s than it has Type 45s. Suddenly they start to look more capable. The research and development costs have gone down. The capabilities, each one's got a useful, and if they do have to end up on operations together, there is a far more useful force. Vision. Love to see a Parliament class destroyer like in Star Trek Lower Decks. Sometimes. And so imagine speaking to a senior naval officer from 110 years ago and trying to explain to them that the destroyer is your big hitter. Yeah, that'd be fun. But you just turn around and say the words, politics, and they go, oh, so you mean it's not a destroyer? It is a destroyer. It's called a destroyer. But it's not a destroyer. Politics. Juicy student. The likely only way to get a Canadian flagship with a Batch 2 Canadian Service Command, there's basically a stretch CSE with extra cheese and the secret sauce. Who knows? Yeah, it's when you turn around and go 16,000 ton destroyers. Now, here is an area which it could be potentially most interesting, and that's uncrewed systems. For the Canberra class, for New Zealand, for Canada. No, another one. Death to the mosquitoes. All of these ships are going to require uncrewed systems. Development of this particular interesting vessel, and another one died to dust, is particularly interesting because what's it for? It's for some undersea operations. It's large enough it could be modified. The design could be developed and modified to carry torpedoes. It could lay mines. It could be sitting there as an off-vessel listening post. It could be the future of anti-submarine warfare. Sonar buoys, which move and self-deploy, could well be also be part of that. Uncrewed aircraft flying off an LHD, an LHA, an aircraft carrier. All of these are things we're going to be considering in the future. All right, just closing the door. Just reaching the point at which it's cold enough, there are going to be mosquitoes coming for me. And not just my iron brew. Why do they come for the iron brew? Why come and nick the iron brew? It's terrible. Anyway. So, this is another area where the systems also, but all these nations have large areas and large expanses of ocean they need to patrol. They need presence in. Again, uncrewed systems development. Honestly, I see this as being the biggest area of where they could cooperate. And the area of most overlap. MC Legend, how capable would the United Kansas fleet be? Well, you have the paper strength of it would be very capable. The reality would be it spread so thin across such a large part of the ocean, and the world, it would be absolutely atrocious. There's your answer. That's what a Kansas fleet would be. Operationally in wartime, coming together as allies to produce task groups, that's the viability. To actually defend a combined, to produce a combined force to defend all the various interests of the groups of those nations together would require a significant number of ships. More than they actually have, although they don't actually have enough to defend themselves either at the moment either. The more likely outcome is that the first 4 to 6 vessels will be most capable of CSCs. The final ships of the build may feature a stripped-down ASW variant model without SPY-7. Potentially. Although, I doubt it. Especially if Russia goes more Rogue Nation-ish. It all depends on what happens post-Ukraine, and also depends on what happens in the East and the South China Seas. Graham, don't worry. Iron Brew means they don't tend to come after me. They don't tend to try for my blood, or if they do, they die horribly on me. Vision. Type 83 should have a flight deck, the big hangar for drone aircraft, and big hangar with well deck for drone subs. Bring back the catapult for aircraft drones? Could be interesting. Concurrent. The scale of the non-US UV screen air deployable assets, possibly parachuted in mid-ocean, Pacific from a cargo hailer. I would point out there is a human being standing there. Yeah, the Americans are bigger, but let's be honest, they're not much smaller. They might be air deployable, but I don't think they're going to be air droppable. Not unless you really do want to increase and modify equipment. And then you're going to have to go pick them up because they're not cheap either. Wayne's World of Science and Technology. Wayne, I'm not sure if you've been listening to the thrust of the discussion about Britain, but honestly, Britain and Australia are not just concerned about local defence. They are both incredibly dependent on global trade and very much concerned about it. You said Canada is worried about trade lanes, local defence not so much. No, I'd say Canada. I'd say all three are to an extent worried about local defence, but all three are also worried about global trade lanes. Britain is very much worried about. That's the whole reason. Why is Britain deploying its carrier groups to the Far East? Why is it doing that? It's because it's worried about global trade lanes, because it's dependent upon the global trade lanes, because economically, as I said, dependent upon the trade and the movement of goods going around the world and the current trading model. Australia is the same energy-wise; it's dependent upon the movement of good and movement of trade, and economic-wise because it's so much exporting raw materials. An automatic laser-based anti-mosquito system could be satisfaction. To be fair, I have some electronic systems which do keep down the mosquito numbers. Trust me, there is a lot more out there because we have about 3 or 4 ponds in the in the garden, and there's only been a couple in here come in here. A few. Yeah, I've killed about 4 mozzies and a daddy longlegs. Submarine deploying uncrewed vehicle to search a header act as decoy. Yep. Not very, since a United Kansas fleet is not going to happen. We would not want to sail all the way down there for lamb chops in Victoria and Victoria Bitter. Terrible. Besides, just think of the iron brew exports. Anyway, so this is the United Kansas fleet, by the way. I'm not sure who produced this lovely little diagram, but they did. We've got carriers, amphibious shipping. We have submarines. We have destroyers, frigates, replenishment at sea, all these things, auxiliaries, mine countermeasures, and OPVs. Yeah. But the more thing about that is that no, it's not. A combined fleet is not going to happen. However, that's actually, when you start to look at it, actually a sustainable force from a development and research perspective. You could actually spread the cost quite a lot more. Yes, I do say Britain needs to build more destroyers, and Australia's got 3 and they need more as well. But the thing is, you can spread the cost far more if you're building ships. That's what's happening with the Type 26s. The cost is being massively spread, which is helpful. Go, where does the Russian Poseidon fit in this diagram? Or is it more like a kind of smarter torpedo-like cruise missile rather than the UAV? A bit of both. Jack Ray, with all the drone usage and research, I hope the USN and RN are progressing laser-based AA for killing drones. Well, again, we can talk about it. The US has been deploying lasers at sea for a while now. They've had a ship fitted with a laser for a while, and they've been working on it for a while. So, in the nicest way, lasers have been under progress, and Britain's been talking about lasers for its next generation of ships for a while as well. So, yeah, these systems haven't been installed, but mostly that's because they're vaporware, but because no one sort of needed to spend the money. And when I say no one sort of needs to spend the money, I mean the Ministry of Defence couldn't persuade the Treasury to spend the money. Basically, the combined fleet is the size of what the RN should be. I'm not quite sure about that. There's some interesting ships there, but I would point out that one of the interesting things is when you start to look at the amphibious forces, and you go, right then, one of those Bay classes belongs to Australia, but the 3 are still British. 2 LHDs belong to Australia, but the 2 LPDs belong to the UK. So that's 5 of those ships. Oh, and those 4 strategic roll-on, roll-off ships are all British as well, those 4. So that means that the amphibious shipping, you've got 9 are British, and the 2 carriers are British. We start to go down the submarines, we go down all the various... The case is that it's almost spending as proportion of their populations, and it makes sense, and their economies. But the British underspend because of the way they account for their spending. There are things included in British defence expenditure which I would argue are not things which should be included in defence expenditure. Pensions. And a few other bits. War memorials. These are not things which shouldn't be having money spent on. I support spending of money on this. Pensions are much necessary. War memorials are necessary. They should be spent on. But I don't think they should be included in defence accounting. I think the EU Navy is bigger than Kansas Fleet. It gets interesting once you get down to the replenishment at sea vessels, etc. And I'm not sure, again, that's the full accounting on all the replenishment at sea ships. Ground, just as well you aren't a Buddhist. You just flatter your great aunt or uncle. No, if my great aunt or uncle came back as a mosquito, they'd want me to finish it off so they could get reincarnated as something cooler. My great uncle was said if he came back as anything, it was going to be an elephant. He wanted the trunk. He wanted the trunk. That was his entire desire. He wanted the trunk. Siege 19. How easy would it be to operate F-35C from the LHDs? Well, you're not going to be operating the F-35C from the LHDs. That's the Cadabar version. The F-35B, you'd have to refit the Canberra class completely. And I've said it pretty much came because building Remium. But to operate LHDs, to supplement, build supplements LHDs to supplement the QEs, it would be, as I said, I've talked about the Trieste class. That'd be what I modify. I'd build a sort of enlarged, slightly longer Trieste class. George Newman, I'm glad you were having fun mowing your pasture. Wayne Borean, Alex, do you know what the Homer Mallow syndrome is? Oh, good lord. That's one of those things for which there are actually many names. I think I call it a different name. Mm-hmm. No, and not that one on. No, not coming up. So I'm not sure, but my variation of the Homer Mallow syndrome basically comes down to a variation of the Peter principle. Listen, Canada has a separate department for that stuff, but that doesn't help our underspending issue. I think, and the QEs would not be cheaper. In a nice way, LHDs would not be cheaper than the QEs. Okay? Again, you do need LHDs as well as Queen Elizabeth, and you need them to have ski ramps capable. But you can't keep going. They're going to sell them off if you get them. They're not. The thing is, that's the capability. Britain operated HMS Ocean at the same time as the Invincibles. No one sold off the Invincibles because you had Ocean. We built the Bay class at the same time as we had Albion and Bulwark. We didn't sell off Albion and Bulwark. We sold off one of the bays. You've got to get out of the mindset, and this I hear a lot in the British military and British military discussions. Oh, if we get this thing, we won't get the other one. If we get SSKs, we won't get SSNs. If we get UAVs, we won't get crewed aircraft. If we get this, we won't get that. Start making a proper case for it. Nice way. The whole reason the Royal Navy's got the funding it has done is it's actually started wising up and making a decent case and a decent business and strategic case for its equipment and its procurement. And yes, I do keep hearing colleagues who are from the Army side of things going, well, why is the Army not getting the funding? It needs more funding as well. And you sit there and go, because the Army for the last several decades has been able to just point to Iraq or Afghanistan and go, we need money. And that's worked. And now they're not in there. They're having a real trouble trying to figure out how to make the case for their funding. And that's going to take them a few years to figure out. And that meant in the recent Strategic Defence Review, they weren't in a good place. And that's why it seems like it's a good one for the Navy, and the Army in comparison suffered. But it's not because anyone actually there was a bias, or the Navy was doing anything underhand, or the Air Force was doing anything underhand. It was literally because the Army's case was they just weren't prepared to make the case. They hadn't really thought it through, because for years they had one scenario to do, and suddenly they didn't have that. Decision 90. Dreadnoughts will be 1-for-1 replaced with Vanguards, correct? Yep. No, we're not going to use cruise missiles as well. You don't want to operate cruise missiles from the same hull you operate ballistic missiles from. For starters, does that mean you're going to deploy your strategic deterrent to a position where it could be in range of the enemy for them to find an attack, because the cruise missiles will? Also, by the way, when you fire cruise missiles, you're going to reveal the position of your strategic deterrent. No. And then people go, well, why don't we just put cruise missiles, and some of the cruise missiles have nuclear warheads, because then we might fire the wrong cruise missile, the one with the nuclear warheads, rather than one with the normal warhead. So let's keep things separate, please. Now, I do think the next generation of SSNs will probably be Virginias, will be like the Virginias, and will probably have a VLS module in them, because of the fact that we didn't include VLS in the Astutes is just absurd. There are good reasons for it, but basically they have limited the Astutes dramatically. Whereas if we'd included a small component of, let's say, VLS tubes, I don't know, 2 banks of 8, we could have had 16 strike Tomahawks sitting in each of our attack subs, and that would have been a great force multiplier and wouldn't really affect the design that much. Yeah, Stafford, they would bolster the Kanzuk fleet, but the thing is, you have to first get Canada to pay for them. Which means you have to make a jolly good case for them. Going towards science technology. Home engineering is what happens when a technically advanced culture sells goods to a culture with less technical capabilities. Then when war starts, you cut them off and their culture then undergoes an economic collapse. Yeah. That's the theory, anyway. Practice can be slightly different. But as I said, I'm not the fine of the Peter principle, but applied to countries, because it's if your country allows yourself to be in a scenario where you're just depending upon buying things, you've got yourself into trouble. When it comes down to the USN, I do not think accidentally firing cruise missile nuke instead of conventional is a realistic concern. No, I was talking about the Royal Navy. And before people say it's never happened, it has happened. People have accidentally loaded the wrong cruise missiles. They have accidentally had these issues. Because the trouble is, if they all look at the same, you can have the issues. Now, yes, those accidents are very rare. Yes, the number of false firings and false droppings of nuclear weapons is incredibly rare. But I don't see any problem in ensuring the maximum unlikelihood of that happening. And the maximum unlikelihood of that happening is nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, they're there. Everything else is conventional. Thank you very much. We're all kept nice and separate. I like that system. That's a good system. There's no risk for a ballistic missiles warhead being accidentally put onto a cruise missile. None at all. So I like that. I know we can argue it's very unlikely to happen, and I have absolute faith in the Royal Navy's professionalism and absolute faith that they would do their level best for it not to happen. And if it did happen, it'd be a very rare concurrence of events. However, I like the chance. I like it better when you say there is absolutely no chance of it happening because they're completely different systems. That I love. That I have real joy with. Monhow, VS stands for Vertical Launch System. It's what we use to put missiles in. I know the French ships at Meuse didn't have the armor to stand up to British 15-inch guns, but was there anything else that makes these ships so vulnerable? Do you have any video Meuse? I have done a bit of video Meuse a bit, but yeah, particularly, it's not nothing that makes them particularly vulnerable. It's just they're mostly light ships. Siege 90. So you think all SSNs in the future will be hybrid SSN GNs a la Virginia and Yasen? To an extent, yeah. I think you're going to have more cruise missiles fitted onto them. Anthony Mitchell, yes, the airstreets were already a big increase in size due to the use of the larger PWR2s designed for the SSBNs. Yeah, and the next generation are going to be even bigger. Listen, does the IR not utilize PAL with nuclear warheads? A variation of it, yes, I think they do. But I still would. It's going to sound strange. Yes, you can make the case for all the systems. And I understand them and I accept them. Everyone makes the case and they go about these systems and they're very. But in practice, when you look at the history, how many times have the wrong cruise missile warheads been loaded into the wrong missiles and accidentally dropped in the wrong places? There was a scramble during the Bosnian crisis because they thought the wrong warheads had been loaded. There was a scramble during the Gulf War when they thought the wrong warheads had been loaded. Now, they turned out they hadn't, which is good. But there have also been the actual bombs accidentally dropped and all these things. I just like to go from low risk to insignificant amount of risk to no risk. That's just my personal preference. So yes, we can sit there and discuss the various capabilities, but I like a system whereby nuclear weapons are in this system and only fit that system, and that's fine. They're there. They are nice and far away from everything else. Vision. US Air Force accidentally loaded 2 nuclear-armed missiles instead of training dummies onto a B-52 and flew it across country. The mistake was found out after the bomber had landed. Yeah. Oh. I don't know. They finally caught us. US Air Force managed to make the mistake. Yeah, we'll not leave that one. I'd be curious to know about that. To be honest, wrong warheads. But looking at history, PAL also didn't used to be a thing with such things. True, but I'm still look. Yes, you can build in systems, but I would prefer there to be. And as I said, they minimize risk, but that's not no risk. Whereas ballistic missile takes the nukes, tactical missiles conventional, basically limits the risk of the wrong warhead going on each thing. Also, even if the RN crew does not make mistakes, would the Chinese or Russian early warning crews be error free? Who knows? So, how does one get out of the view of the treasury and equipment? Are the army's problems a case of they have nothing and are paying the price? No, the army's problems is that, well, to be honest, it's compounded with Ajax system. And again, they tend to point out to the other problem for the army is that if you point out and go, well, the Navy's got the carriers and they cost this much. Yes, but they've already been spent and the carriers are now in service. Whereas your program is some money which has yet to be spent. So you're not going to make the case. It's like the Eurofighter. There is no point pointing to Eurofighter and pointing out how much it cost, because that isn't going to get you the money to build your. You're going to have to point to a current system, and you're not going to manage to make the case versus the F-35 at the moment because everyone's looking at air power and going, "That's pretty useful." It's kind of like making a case against uncrewed aircraft. It's not going to happen. The Ajax has run into issues, and the Ajax as a concept is great. The Ajax, as it's being built in reality, is not so good. And you sit there occasionally and go, we should have gone CV90. Because, yes, it's a 90% rather than a theoretical 100% solution to what we need. But it would have been in service by now and would have been a cost we could have predicted and would have been okay. And we'd have lots of other people who are using with us. Incorrect. They loaded 2 pylons, one with 6 missiles, Sands warhead, one pylon with 6 nuclear armed cruise missiles. That was a transport error, not a weapons employment error. No, but the trouble is, if you can have a transport error, you can also have a other error, and I'd prefer to just not run the risk. I don't consider that a particularly contentious issue in my mind. To just go, look, I'd like to just not run the risk. Century 19. The Soviets are also very big on automation in SNs partly because they lack professional manpower as opposed to conscripts to man them. Has the RN gone the same way? Not really. They've got more of it than the US because the US has got 135 crew for their Virginia class, whereas the Astutes are usually 90 something. So yeah, the RN's sort of a bit between the two, and I think the British will probably go down a bit more. But I don't think they'll go down that much. But I think it's more viable for Australia and Canada if you're going for a nuclear program to base it off the British crew modelling than the US crew modelling. No, the trouble is, again, with the Ajax program, which has been around so long, there have been so many people involved in it, that you would be getting rid of most of the senior leadership of the British Army and probably going after quite a lot of people who are retired, who are now directors of various companies. No, super. Honestly, I disagree. The ability to carry a weapon and the ability to activate and deploy a weapon are 2 hugely separate things. No, I agree those are 2 hugely separate things, but I also say this. You're sort of sitting there going, okay, it's fine, you should have both have. But if you're talking about a submarine deployed cruise missile system, and the submarines all carrying cruise missiles, some of those submarines carry nuclear tipped cruise missiles and some don't. But it depends on their deployment, because if you're using an SSGN design to produce both your tactical submarine and your deterrent submarine, then they're all going to have, all those subs will be built to the same standard. They'll all have the ability to use nuclear warheads. They might fire the cruise missiles, and it won't go off, but it'll still be a nuclear warhead that's fired. And you've got a limited number of nuclear weapons because Britain doesn't build a lot of them. Also, you've just given a nuclear weapon, or rather nuclear material, to a nation in which you're presumably firing warheads on. That's not a scenario I want to be in. I don't want to be in. Yeah, you can say there's no risk, there's no risk, there's no risk of this because of the control and command and control systems. And I go, yes, the risk is very small. Not no risk, but a very, very small. But I prefer not to be in a place where there's any risk. And so I like the separation. I like the strategic deterrent being a ballistic missile on a ballistic missile submarine that goes off and does its patrol. And I like having two cruise missiles to be fired from from the conventional submarines and from the surface ships. I like them being separate. I like there being no overlap because it's, to me, yes, it's a case of yes, is a case. It's, instead of it being a case of a very small, very unlikely risk, to being no risk, because the warheads for one will not fit onto the other, so there is no chance of them going wrong, and it being a mistake, and a dud nuclear warhead being fired at someone, or even worse, a warhead being fired at someone which you don't realize is nuclear and actually going off. I just like to eliminate the risk completely. Gogalanda, it's come to a middle ground. Let's paint the nukes a different color, like I'm going to red. They are painted different colors quite often. Ken Ray, does the RN dual crew does spins? Yes. To what extent does dual crew increase fiability? That's how they guarantee one at sea at all times. They have basically 6 crews for 4 boats, I think, is what they really run at, to guarantee the ability to have a submarine at sea and give people basically a quality of life. Take care, Ronald. Now, do you believe Taiwan will develop a nuclear weapon? Taiwan was part of the program with South Africa and Israel. We know South Africa, the country which was least motivated, did actually develop nuclear weapons and dispose of them. We're all fairly certain Israel has them. So why do you believe Taiwan is still developing them or doesn't have them? I don't know. I have no proof. But as I've said before in bilge pumps, I am highly suspicious of the idea they don't. TJ90, do you think we'll ever see Nature is coming or something? Never knows. Who knows what the Type 83s will be named? 97. For another point of view, however, the same reason we don't use conventionally armed SBM, I agree. Yes. I just don't like the confusion. Gogalana, seriously though, doesn't this put more pressure on SSBMs and making any loss of those vessels more problematic? Let's put it this way. You attack an SS ballistic missile submarine, that's automatically considered an attack on strategic deterrent. If you attack that, that's considered the same as launching a strike. They respond. But also that's also one of the reasons why the amount of effort they put into making those vessels disappear once they're at sea is obscene. But that also is why you tend to have a Type 23 or eventually a Type 26 operating in a similar area to a SSBN going in and out to sea. You tend to have patrol vessels, everything, and often an attack sub not far away to make sure no one is listening to them in the point at which they can be found, and so allowing them to disappear. And they go and disappear into the deepest, darkest reaches of the North Atlantic. And just remember, these are vessels which are so quiet that neither a French and a British SBN managed to bash into each other because neither of them heard each other, so they had a head-on collision. Neither of them heard the other. Vision, when you visit Buffalo, we might see how missile replenishment at sea was done with the Talos in the 1960s. Photos have been done online. Cool. Graham, I could imagine. Sorry, we didn't mean to nuke you. Please excuse the mistake. We will have an inquiry. Yeah. The other problem is, as Melanie has said, and some people have also pointed out, is what do they launch and is it coming at us? It's why reportedly the only weapons with nukes launched by the US Navy are ballistic missiles. Although they did used to occasionally carry nuclear components on their carriers for bombs. We'll leave that to one side. When was the collision? A few years ago. A French and a British submarine, ballistic missile submarine. It was in the news. They both ended up coming home with busted noses. I think so. What's tomorrow's UAD video? Not recorded yet. Going to be recorded tomorrow morning. So, how far away do you think we are from being able to detect submarines using satellites? How far away are we from having a 90% accurate model of the behavior of the oceans? Because the moment you can accurately model and monitor the behavior of the oceans from satellites is the moment you can accurately pick out where it's not behaving as you expect it to behave. And the moment you can pick out where it's not behaving as you expect it to behave is the moment you can start working out where probable submarines are. There you go. Kenry, thank you. Well, it's a patron suggested topic, some from Wayne Borean. So, yeah, if the patron suggests the topics, I'm quite happy to do them. Right. I am hungry and I'm going to go get some food because I haven't eaten. So, thank you very much, everyone. I hope you've had a nice evening. I hope you've enjoyed what's been coming up. I have got all sorts of videos to record over the next 3 days. So you will probably see most of these videos are probably going to be recorded over the next 3 days. So by the time you see me on Sunday, I'll probably be going, which is why I'm sort of glad it's not a Warships. It's a going to be, as requested now, a Galaxy class. Discussion of Star Trek, etc. Because that I can do without having to do any research beforehand because it's already done. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Take care and have a nice evening. Thank you again for all the super chats. Thank you for all the super thanks. Thank you for everyone who's a subscriber. Thank you to everyone who's watched the videos. Thank you to everyone who's a patron. It's really, really kind of you all, and it's really, really helpful. As I discussed at the beginning, pretty much for anyone in my field at the moment, it's the stuff outside university which is keeping us going, and this is really keeping me going. I definitely couldn't be going to Canada, and I definitely couldn't have spent $1,000 today if it wasn't for all of you. So thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, camera equipment is on the way for Canada. It's going to be good. Thank you very much, Aaron. Interestingly, the direct superior, not aboard, to the captain of the USN SBN does not know where the sub is when it's on patrol. No, neither does the British one. They have no idea. Take care, Aaron. Thank you. Thank you, Miles Caskill. Thank you, Stafford. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Sean, for doing the adminning role. Thank you, George Newman. Thank you, Melanie1640. Thank you, Jess P. Thank you, Dacknereg. Thank you, George Newman, Graham Highlander, 96831, CG90. Thank you, Jack Ray. Thank you, Abazaski. Thank you, DG40. Thank you, Matt Johnson. Thank you, Kevin Ray. Thank you, Rick Masava. Thank you, Yickers. Thank you, Colin Cameron. Thank you, Miles McCaskill. Thank you, Dutchman. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Anthony Mitchell. Unfortunately, it was HMS Vanguard on the Triumphant rather than HMS Vigilant and Le Vigilant. That would have been quite fun if the two Vigilants had managed to bash into each other. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care, and have a nice evening. Thank you. Graham Hanley, I spent nearly £200 on books today, nearly passed out. Graham, don't worry. I can spend £200 on a single book. In fact, that still wouldn't even be my most expensive, in the top 5 of most expensive I've had to spend on. So, yeah. You have my sympathy, but yeah. Welcome to the world of, well, basically any level of geekdom. Books get very, very expensive. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Yeah, mine was a lot of very expensive camera gear. It's a case of, yeah, hopefully hopefully none of these bills come in early. None of these bills come in early. Otherwise, I'm going to be in trouble. Thank you very much, Aaron. Take care and have a nice evening.